Tonight, we're sailing into one of the most famous true stories ever told at sea. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, impossible navigation, tropical paradise, harsh discipline, and a mystery that has fascinated historians for more than 2 centuries. Long before the age of steamships, radios, and satellites, one small wooden vessel crossed one of the largest oceans on Earth, only for its crew to divide against itself in a single dramatic morning that changed maritime history forever. Where in the world are you listening from today? Is it early morning with a fresh cup of coffee, a quiet afternoon, or the middle of the night when everyone else has already fallen asleep? I genuinely love to know. So leave a comment telling me your country and what time it is where you are. And if slow, immersive history helps you relax, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you won't miss the next journey into the forgotten corners of the past. Picture the endless Pacific stretching to every horizon. Imagine the smell of damp wood, salt carried by warm trade winds, and sails snapping high above your head. Somewhere in that peaceful blue world, friendships quietly became resentments. Respect slowly turned into doubt. Small disagreements gathered weight day after day, until one sunrise would decide the fate of every person aboard. The mutiny on HMS Bounty has often been remembered as a simple battle between a cruel captain and a noble rebel. But history is rarely that simple. The real people were more complicated than the legends that later surrounded them. Captain William Bligh was both extraordinarily skilled and deeply demanding. Fletcher was neither an obvious villain nor an obvious hero. The truth lies somewhere between admiration and criticism, hidden beneath journals, court records, official reports, and the memories of the few who survived long enough to tell their stories. So settle in, relax your shoulders, and let your imagination drift back to the year 1787. The British Empire was expanding across the globe. The Royal Navy protected trade routes that connected continents, while scientists, merchants, and government officials searched for new opportunities in distant lands. Explorers had recently mapped enormous portions of the Pacific Ocean, revealing islands that seemed almost untouched by European influence. Among those islands was Tahiti. To many Europeans, Tahiti appeared almost unreal. Travelers described fertile valleys, waterfalls pouring through green mountains, coconut palms bending toward white beaches, and communities whose daily lives seemed peaceful compared with the rigid discipline of 18th century Europe. Some of these descriptions were romanticized, while others reflected genuine admiration. Whatever the truth, Tahiti captured Britain's imagination. Meanwhile, another concern occupied plantation owners thousands of miles away in the Caribbean. Sugar plantations depended on feeding enormous numbers of enslaved workers. Plantation owners wanted a cheap, reliable source of food that could grow easily in tropical climates. Their attention turned toward the breadfruit tree, whose large, nutritious fruits flourished naturally across islands of the South Pacific. The idea sounded simple enough. Collect young breadfruit plants from Tahiti, carry them safely across the oceans, plant them in the Caribbean. If successful, Britain hoped to create an inexpensive food supply for enslaved laborers working on sugar estates. The project required someone who understood long-distance navigation better than almost anyone alive. That man was William Bligh. Born in 1754, Bligh had entered the Royal Navy while still young. More importantly, he had served under the celebrated explorer Captain James Cook during Cook's final voyage around the Pacific. There, Bligh developed exceptional navigational abilities. He learned how to chart coastlines with remarkable accuracy, calculate positions across vast oceans, and keep ships alive in places where mistakes often proved fatal. Among professional sailors, these skills earned considerable respect. Years later, when the Admiralty needed an experienced navigator for the breadfruit expedition, Bligh became an obvious choice. Interestingly, HMS Bounty was not originally designed as a naval warship. She had begun life as a merchant vessel named Bethia, built in 1784. The Royal Navy purchased her, renamed her Bounty, and modified her for transporting hundreds of breadfruit plants. Large sections of the deck would eventually become floating gardens filled with carefully watered pots instead of rows of cannons. Although officially part of the Royal Navy, Bounty carried surprisingly little firepower. Her mission was scientific and agricultural rather than military. She also carried a relatively small crew. 46 men would sail from England. Unlike larger naval vessels that possessed several commissioned officers, Bounty had only one commissioned officer aboard, Lieutenant William Bligh himself. This unusual arrangement created a chain of command that depended heavily on trust, cooperation, and personal relationships rather than numerous senior officers sharing responsibility. One of the young men selected for the voyage was Fletcher Christian. Christian came from Cumberland in northern England. He belonged to a respectable family, although financial difficulties affected their fortunes. Intelligent, energetic, and capable, he had sailed with Bligh before on merchant voyages. At first, their relationship appears to have been friendly. Bligh trusted Christian enough to recommend him for this important expedition. Neither man could possibly imagine how history would forever connect their names. Preparations occupied months. Food barrels filled the docks. Navigation instruments were carefully inspected. Ropes, sails, spare timber, medicine chests, livestock, weapons, water casks, and countless ordinary supplies disappeared below deck. Every successful voyage depended upon endless practical details. A missing sail needle, cracked barrel, boiled flour, rotting meat. Each small oversight could become life-threatening halfway across the world. Finally, on December 23, 1787, HMS Bounty departed England. Cold winter weather surrounded the ship as she began her long journey south. Families disappeared behind the horizon. The familiar coast slowly faded into gray distance. Ahead lay one of the longest sea voyages imaginable. Life aboard immediately settled into strict routine. The 18th century Royal Navy functioned through discipline. Watches divided every day and night into carefully measured periods. Bells marked passing time. Sailors climbed rigging hundreds of feet above the sea, scrubbed decks until the wood almost shone, repaired worn ropes, cleaned equipment, and constantly adjusted sails according to changing winds. Fresh water remained precious. Food had to last months. Illness always threatened. Storms could appear without warning. For ordinary sailors, every sunrise promised hard physical labor. Bligh believed efficiency saved lives. He demanded cleanliness because dirty ships encouraged disease. He insisted on accurate record-keeping because careless navigation destroyed expeditions. He expected immediate obedience because hesitation during dangerous weather could sink an entire vessel. Modern readers sometimes interpret such behavior as simple harshness, but naval discipline in the 18th century reflected genuine survival concerns. Still, even reasonable discipline could become exhausting when practiced every single day across thousands upon thousands of miles of open ocean. At first, however, the voyage progressed without any hint that history would remember this small ship forever. The Atlantic rolled beneath her hull. Trade winds carried her steadily south. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, islands of astonishing beauty waited patiently for visitors who had absolutely no idea how completely their lives were about to change. The Atlantic Ocean stretched ahead with almost unimaginable emptiness. 4 days at a time, the crew of HMS Bounty saw nothing except rolling waves, drifting clouds, and the occasional seabird gliding effortlessly over the water. The world became wonderfully simple. The sky rose above them, the sea surrounded them, and the wooden ship beneath their feet became an entire universe. That universe followed a rhythm that never truly stopped. Every 4 hours the watch changed. Bells marked the passing of time. Men climbed into the rigging before sunrise, even when the ropes were slick with rain or coated with salty spray. Others repaired sails worn thin by constant wind. Some pumped water from the bilges below deck. Others prepared meals from salted meat, dried peas, oatmeal, cheese, or hard ship's biscuit that often contained tiny insects after months at sea. Nobody enjoyed the biscuits. Most sailors accepted them simply because there was little choice. Fresh bread disappeared only days after leaving England. Fresh vegetables vanished almost as quickly. As the voyage continued, meals became repetitive, and every sailor understood that preserving supplies mattered more than comfort. Lieutenant William Bligh paid close attention to these details. His journals reveal a commander deeply concerned with the health of his crew. Unlike many captains of the 18th century, Bligh understood the importance of cleanliness. Decks were scrubbed frequently. Bedding was aired whenever weather allowed. Clothing was inspected. The ship itself received constant maintenance because damp, dirty conditions encouraged disease. This concern reflected lessons learned during earlier Pacific voyages, especially those commanded by Captain James Cook. Cook had achieved remarkable success in preventing scurvy, the deadly disease caused by vitamin deficiency that had killed countless sailors during previous centuries. Although doctors of the time did not fully understand vitamins, experienced officers knew that fresh foods, cleanliness, and proper ventilation dramatically improved survival. Bligh adopted many of these practices. The crew may not have appreciated every order, but many of those routines genuinely helped keep them healthy during the months ahead. Navigation occupied much of Bligh's attention. Long before satellites or electronic instruments existed, determining a ship's exact position required extraordinary skill. Each clear day, Bligh climbed onto the quarterdeck carrying a sextant. Holding the polished brass instrument carefully, he measured the angle between the horizon and the sun. Combined with accurate timekeeping and mathematical calculations, these observations allowed him to estimate the ship's location with impressive precision. The process demanded patience. A slight mistake in measurement could place the ship many miles from its true position. Cloudy weather complicated everything. Heavy seas made steady observations nearly impossible. Yet Bligh's reputation as a navigator continued to grow because his calculations consistently proved reliable. Among experienced seamen, few doubted his technical abilities. Meanwhile, Fletcher Christian continued performing his own duties. He had joined the expedition as master's mate, an important position responsible for supervising work aboard the vessel and assisting with navigation. Christian possessed intelligence, confidence, and practical experience gained during previous voyages. Bligh trusted him. In fact, surviving records suggest that during the early months of the expedition, their relationship remained entirely professional. There is little evidence of serious disagreement. The famous conflict that later defined both men's lives had not yet begun. As Bounty sailed farther south, temperatures gradually cooled. The crew approached one of the greatest challenges facing any sailing vessel attempting to reach the Pacific from Europe: Cape Horn. Even today, Cape Horn commands respect among sailors. Situated at the southern tip of South America, where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans collide, the region is famous for violent storms, freezing temperatures, enormous waves, and unpredictable winds. Many ships never survived the passage. Bligh hoped to round Cape Horn and enter the Pacific directly. It would be difficult, but if successful, it offered the shortest route to Tahiti. By March 1788, Bounty reached those dangerous southern waters. The weather changed dramatically. Gone were the warm trade winds. Instead, freezing rain lashed the deck. Powerful winds screamed through the rigging. Dark clouds covered the sky for days. Towering waves crashed over the bow, soaking sailors already exhausted from constant labor. Every rope became slippery. Every sail required careful handling. A single mistake high above the deck could send a sailor falling into the icy sea below. The cold penetrated everything. Clothing remained damp. Blankets never completely dried. Hands cracked from exposure. Faces burned beneath freezing winds. The crew fought not only the weather but also simple exhaustion. Again and again, Bligh attempted to force the ship westward around Cape Horn. Again and again nature refused. For nearly a month, relentless storms drove Bounty backward. Every mile gained through determined sailing disappeared beneath powerful contrary winds. Some days the ship made almost no progress at all. Other days it actually lost distance. Bligh later described waves breaking over the vessel with tremendous force. Rigging required constant repair. The crew worked almost without rest. Yet despite everyone's efforts, the Pacific remained unreachable. Eventually, reality became impossible to ignore. Continuing the attempt risked destroying both ship and crew. Reluctantly, Bligh abandoned the plan. Instead of sailing west around Cape Horn, Bounty turned east. The voyage would now follow a far longer route. She would cross the entire South Atlantic, round the Cape of Good Hope at Africa's southern tip, continue across the vast Indian Ocean, pass through the islands of the East Indies, and only then enter the Pacific. Thousands of additional miles now lay ahead. For the crew, the decision carried mixed emotions. On one hand, escaping the terrible storms brought obvious relief. The farther north they sailed, the warmer the weather became. The sea gradually calmed. Daily routines returned to something resembling normal life. On the other hand, everyone understood that the journey had become much longer than expected. Months would pass before they reached Tahiti. More months of repetitive work. More months of limited food. More months separated from families and home. As weeks became months, the psychological effects of life at sea quietly accumulated. Modern readers sometimes imagine dramatic conflicts erupting suddenly aboard ships. Real history suggests something different. Tension often develops slowly. Small frustrations repeated themselves day after day. An impatient remark. Public criticism. An unpopular order. A disagreement over responsibility. None seemed important alone. Together, over many months, they could gradually reshape relationships. Bligh possessed remarkable strengths. He was energetic, knowledgeable, disciplined, and extraordinarily capable. He also had a sharp tongue. When disappointed, he frequently criticized officers in front of the crew. Instead of reserving complaints for private conversations, Bligh often expressed frustration openly. Surviving journals and testimony from later court proceedings describe him using harsh language toward subordinates. Physical punishment under his command appears to have been relatively limited compared with many Royal Navy captains of the period. His words, however, could sting deeply. Officers who believed themselves honorable sometimes felt humiliated by public criticism. Whether Bligh recognized the long-term consequences of those moments remains uncertain. At the time, he probably considered blunt honesty necessary for maintaining discipline. Some officers accepted it. Others remembered every insult. Meanwhile, Fletcher continued earning additional responsibility. Bligh clearly regarded him as capable. Christian supervised watches, managed sailors, and handled important navigational duties. Nothing yet suggested that these two men would one day stand on opposite sides of one of history's most famous mutinies. Far ahead, beyond countless miles of open ocean, Tahiti waited beneath tropical skies. Neither Bligh nor Christian could know that the island itself, not a battle, not a storm, and not an enemy fleet, would become the turning point that changed everything. HMS Bounty now followed the long eastern route that would eventually carry her across half the world. The decision to abandon Cape Horn had not been made lightly. Lieutenant William Bligh knew that every additional mile consumed supplies, delayed the mission, and tested the patience of his crew. Yet forcing the ship through relentless storms would almost certainly have ended in disaster. A captain's duty was not simply to reach his destination, it was to bring his people there alive. So the Bounty sailed eastward. Week after week, familiar routines continued. The rising sun signaled another day of work. Sailors climbed the masts to adjust sails according to changing winds. Others inspected rigging for frayed lines that might snap during heavy weather. Carpenters repaired worn planks. The cooper examined water barrels for leaks. The cook struggled to prepare meals from provisions that had already spent months at sea. Everything aboard required constant attention. Salt water found its way into every crack. Wood swelled and shrank with changing climates. Iron rusted. Canvas weakened. A ship crossing the world's oceans was never truly at rest. As Bounty approached southern Africa, the weather slowly became more forgiving. Cold winds gave way to warmer breezes. The sea still reminded everyone of its power, but the terrifying storms near Cape Horn faded into memory. The crew welcomed the change. For the first time in many weeks, work became slightly less exhausting. Although conditions improved, Bligh never relaxed his standards. He inspected nearly everything. He checked food stores. He examined navigation logs. He monitored the condition of the sails. He expected officers to perform their duties precisely and corrected mistakes immediately. Many captains of the 18th century Royal Navy behaved in similar ways. Ships depended upon strict organization because confusion at sea could quickly become fatal. Yet personality mattered just as much as regulations. Bligh demanded excellence. When disappointed, he often expressed himself with remarkable bluntness. His surviving journals reveal a man who rarely softened criticism. If an officer performed poorly, Bligh usually said so directly. If a sailor neglected his responsibilities, he was corrected at once. Some respected this approach. Others quietly resented it. The records suggest that Bligh punished fewer men with flogging than many naval commanders of his era. This point is important because later stories often exaggerated his physical harshness. His greatest weakness was not excessive violence. It was the way he spoke. Public criticism could damage pride, especially among junior officers trying to earn respect from the crew. In the close world of a small ship, no disagreement remained private for very long. Meanwhile, Fletcher Christian continued proving himself dependable. Bligh frequently entrusted him with important responsibilities, allowing him to command watches and oversee daily operations. Christian appeared competent, intelligent, and energetic. Fellow officers generally regarded him as capable. Nothing in the official records from this stage of the voyage suggests open hostility between the two men. If tensions existed, they remained beneath the surface. The Bounty rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the vast Indian Ocean. This crossing presented its own challenges. The Indian Ocean covered an immense distance, and favorable winds could disappear without warning. Calm seas often sounded pleasant to those on land, but sailors viewed them differently. Without wind, a sailing ship became almost motionless. The sun beat relentlessly upon the deck. Water supplies had to be carefully protected. The air below deck grew hot and stale. Time itself seemed to slow. Then, just as suddenly, strong winds could return, demanding immediate action from every member of the crew. Life at sea never allowed complete comfort. Bligh kept detailed records throughout the journey. His journal documented weather conditions, sailing directions, distances traveled, and observations about islands and coastlines. Such records were essential for future navigators and reflected the careful habits he had developed while serving under Captain James Cook. Those earlier voyages had taught him that accurate information saved lives. Every chart corrected, every coastline measured, every reef identified. Knowledge transformed dangerous oceans into navigable highways. Months passed. The Bounty stopped at several locations to replenish supplies whenever possible. Fresh water remained especially valuable. Whenever the crew could refill barrels from clean streams, they seized the opportunity. Fresh fruit and vegetables also became treasured discoveries. Long voyages carried the constant threat of nutritional illness, even with Bligh's careful attention to hygiene. Any opportunity to improve the crew's diet was welcomed. The voyage gradually carried the ship through the waters of the East Indies. European trading posts, local kingdoms, and merchant vessels connected cultures from across Asia. These waters bustled with activity compared with the lonely expanses of the Atlantic and Southern Oceans. For many sailors aboard the Bounty, these distant lands seemed almost unimaginable before the voyage began. Different languages echoed through harbors. New spices filled the air. Unfamiliar plants covered the shore. Every stop reminded them how enormous the world truly was. Yet the expedition could not linger. Its purpose remained clear. Tahiti, breadfruit. the Caribbean. Everything else represented only a temporary interruption. As the ship continued eastward, temperatures rose noticeably. Heavy wool clothing became uncomfortable. Warm tropical breezes replaced the colder winds of southern latitudes. The sea itself changed color, shifting from darker gray waters to brilliant shades of deep blue. Flying fish occasionally burst from the waves, gliding remarkable distances before disappearing again beneath the surface. Seabirds became more numerous. These signs suggested land might not be far away. After nearly 10 exhausting months since leaving England, anticipation quietly spread throughout the crew. Rumors traveled faster than official announcements. Someone believed they had seen distant clouds gathering over mountains. Another sailor claimed seabirds never ventured so far from land. Every observation sparked excitement. Then, on October 26, 1788, after one of the longest voyages imaginable, the mountains of Tahiti finally appeared on the horizon. At first they looked almost unreal. Dark peaks rose above the sea, partially hidden beneath drifting white clouds. As the Bounty sailed closer, details slowly emerged. Dense forests covered the hillsides. Palm trees lined the beaches. Streams flowed down green valleys toward the coast. After months surrounded by nothing but ocean, the sight seemed almost miraculous. For many sailors, it was the most beautiful landscape they had ever seen. Anchors were dropped in Matavai Bay. The voyage to Tahiti was over. The mission itself, however, had only just begun. Bligh's orders required him to collect hundreds of young breadfruit plants, but nature followed its own schedule. The trees were not yet ready. The plants needed time before they could safely survive transplantation. The delay would last about 5 months. At first glance, this seemed merely inconvenient. In reality, those 5 months would alter nearly every life aboard the Bounty. Unlike the cramped discipline of the ship, Tahiti offered space, warmth, fresh food, and remarkable hospitality. European visitors frequently described the island as peaceful and abundant, though those accounts often reflected their own expectations as much as the reality of Tahitian society. The crew soon found themselves surrounded by generous islanders willing to trade food, share local customs, and welcome visitors into their communities. Fresh fruit replaced stale biscuits. Cool streams replaced carefully rationed water. Soft beds on shore replaced crowded hammocks below deck. For sailors who had spent almost a year living within the narrow confines of a wooden ship, the contrast felt overwhelming. Many formed close friendships with Tahitian families. Several entered romantic relationships with Tahitian women. Some began imagining a life very different from the one they had always known. They did not yet realize it, but every peaceful day spent beneath Tahiti's palm trees was making the return to naval discipline far more difficult than anyone aboard the Bounty could possibly imagine. For the first time in nearly a year, the men of HMS Bounty could wake without seeing nothing but open sea in every direction. Instead, they opened their eyes to green mountains rising above mist-covered valleys. Coconut palms swayed gently in the trade winds. Clear streams flowed down from the hills. Birds called from dense forests, and the warm air carried the scent of flowering plants unlike anything most of the crew had ever experienced in Europe. After 10 months of disciplined routine aboard a small wooden ship, Tahiti felt almost unbelievable. The contrast could not have been greater. Life aboard the Bounty had been governed by bells, watches, inspections, and endless labor. Every hour belonged to duty. Every movement was directed by necessity. On Tahiti, life seemed to move according to the rhythm of nature. The islanders cultivated breadfruit, bananas, taro, coconuts, yams, and many other crops that flourished in the tropical climate. Fishing provided abundant food from the surrounding reefs and lagoons. Clothing was light, the weather was warm, and daily survival did not appear to require the constant struggle familiar to European sailors. Many members of the crew were deeply impressed. Some later described Tahiti as one of the most beautiful places they had ever seen. Historians today caution that European visitors often misunderstood Tahitian society. They sometimes viewed the island through romantic ideas about an untouched paradise, overlooking its own complex political structures, traditions, religious beliefs, and social rules. Tahiti was not a fantasy. It was a highly organized Polynesian society with chiefs, priests, skilled navigators, farmers, craftsmen, and long-established customs developed over centuries. Bligh understood this better than many later storytellers would suggest. During Captain James Cook's voyages, European officers had already gained considerable knowledge about the island. Bligh followed many of those earlier practices, encouraging fair trade and generally respectful relations with local communities. Very quickly, exchanges began. Iron tools fascinated many Tahitians because metal remained extremely valuable on the island. In return, the crew received fresh food, pigs, coconuts, fruit, vegetables, and assistance in gathering the breadfruit plants that formed the purpose of the expedition. For sailors accustomed to salted meat and hard biscuits, fresh fruit seemed almost luxurious. Health improved noticeably. The crew regained strength. Skin damaged by months of sea air slowly recovered. Smiles became more common. Even the atmosphere aboard the Bounty changed. Bligh's official mission now required patience rather than sailing. The young breadfruit plants could not yet be transported safely. They needed several months to mature before beginning the long voyage toward the Caribbean. So a nursery had to be established on shore. Gardeners and local workers carefully prepared hundreds of young breadfruit plants. Each would eventually be placed in specially designed pots aboard the ship. Keeping them alive during an ocean crossing would require constant watering and careful protection from salt spray. Ironically, these plants would later receive more fresh water than many sailors. As weeks passed, the crew spent increasing amounts of time ashore. Many developed genuine friendships with Tahitian families. Some learned portions of the local language. Others became familiar with customs that initially seemed completely foreign. Several sailors entered romantic relationships that became deeply personal. Among the most well-known was Fletcher Christian. Historical sources indicate that Christian formed a close relationship with a Tahitian woman named Mawachua, who was also known to Europeans by the name Isabella. Like many relationships formed during European voyages to the Pacific, understanding its full nature is difficult. Tahitian customs surrounding relationships differed significantly from European expectations, and later written accounts often reflected those cultural misunderstandings. What is clear is that Christian grew emotionally attached to Tahiti. He was not alone. Many members of the crew began imagining lives that no longer revolved around naval discipline. Days passed beneath warm sunshine instead of cold rain. Fresh meals replaced preserved rations. Laughter replaced the endless sound of creaking timbers and crashing waves. The island offered something sailors rarely experienced: freedom. At least it seemed that way. Bligh remained focused on his responsibilities. His journal entries reveal constant attention to the breadfruit project. He supervised the collection of plants, recorded progress carefully, and maintained discipline among the crew despite the relaxed surroundings. Yet discipline became increasingly difficult. Some sailors stayed ashore longer than permitted. Others neglected duties. A few deserted entirely. Desertion represented a serious crime under naval law. Leaving a Royal Navy vessel without permission could ultimately result in severe punishment. 3 crew members attempted exactly that. Charles Churchill, John Millward, and William Muspratt disappeared into the interior of Tahiti, hoping to avoid returning to the ship. Bligh acted immediately. He organized search parties with assistance from Tahitian leaders. The island itself proved too interconnected for the fugitives to remain hidden for long. After several weeks, all 3 men were captured and returned to the Bounty. Bligh punished them according to naval regulations. The incident demonstrated something important. Not everyone wished to continue the voyage. Some men had already decided that Tahiti offered a better future than Britain ever could. Although Fletcher Christian remained loyal at this stage, he undoubtedly witnessed how strongly some crew members wished to stay. The experience left an impression. Bligh also faced another challenge. Items occasionally disappeared. Small thefts became a recurring problem. Sometimes members of the crew exchanged naval equipment without permission. Sometimes local visitors took objects they considered valuable. Cultural differences complicated matters. Concepts of ownership did not always match between British sailors and Tahitians. Objects Europeans considered private property could sometimes be viewed differently within local customs. Bligh frequently found himself investigating missing tools, nails, ropes, or other supplies essential to the expedition. Each incident increased his frustration. His language toward officers occasionally became sharper. He expected constant vigilance. If equipment disappeared, someone must answer for it. His criticism, often delivered publicly, continued to affect relationships aboard the ship. For officers already growing accustomed to the relaxed life ashore, returning to strict naval expectations felt increasingly uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the breadfruit nursery flourished. Hundreds of healthy young plants slowly reached the proper stage for transport. The expedition's primary objective was finally becoming achievable. Preparations for departure quietly began. Water casks were inspected. Rigging received repairs. Food stores were replenished. The specially constructed greenhouse aboard the Bounty was made ready to receive its living cargo. Every step brought the voyage closer to leaving Tahiti. For many sailors, that realization produced conflicting emotions. Duty demanded departure. Their hearts increasingly wished to remain. Fletcher Christian found himself standing between those two worlds. He remained one of Bligh's most trusted officers. Yet he had also built meaningful connections on the island. The approaching departure forced every man aboard to confront a painful truth. Everything they had come to enjoy would soon disappear behind the horizon. The familiar routine of watches, inspections, commands, and endless ocean would return. Most accepted that reality. Few dreaded it. None of them, not Bligh, not Christian, nor the rest of the crew, could yet know that within only a matter of weeks after leaving this peaceful island, the friendships forged in Tahiti, combined with months of accumulated tension at sea, would begin pushing the Bounty toward one of the most famous mornings in maritime history. The 5 months spent at Tahiti passed more quickly than anyone aboard HMS Bounty expected. The days blended together beneath warm sunshine and gentle trade winds. The breadfruit nursery continued to flourish, while the crew settled into routines very different from those that had governed life at sea. For many of the sailors, the island no longer felt like a temporary stop. It had begun to feel like home. That feeling would soon be tested. By early April 1789, Lieutenant William Bligh determined that the young breadfruit plants were finally ready for transport. Hundreds of carefully selected saplings had been placed into specially constructed pots. They would require fresh water every day throughout the long voyage to the Caribbean. Preparing the Bounty became a complicated operation. The ship had never been intended to carry so many living plants. Much of the available deck space had been transformed into what was essentially a floating greenhouse. Wooden racks held the pots securely. Canvas coverings offered protection from harsh sunlight and salt spray. The plants represented the entire purpose of the expedition. Without them, nearly 16 months of sailing would have achieved nothing. Bligh knew exactly how much depended upon their survival. The crew, however, saw something else. Every barrel of fresh water carefully reserved for the breadfruit plants reminded them that water for people might one day become limited. During difficult passages, both sailors and plants would compete for the same precious supply. At the moment, this seemed only a practical concern. Later, it would become one more source of resentment. Before departure, final farewells spread quietly across the island. These moments receive surprisingly little attention in official naval records, yet they appear repeatedly in later accounts written by members of the expedition. Some sailors embraced Tahitian families who had welcomed them for months. Others exchanged small gifts. Many promised they would someday return, though most knew such promises were unlikely ever to be fulfilled. For Fletcher Christian, the farewell appears to have been especially emotional. His relationship with Mawachua had become one of the strongest personal ties formed during the stay on Tahiti. Like several other officers and sailors, Christian was now leaving behind someone who mattered deeply to him. No surviving source allows historians to know exactly what passed between them in those final hours. What remains certain is that Christian departed with great reluctance. On April 4, 1789, HMS Bounty raised her anchor. The island slowly drifted astern. The green mountains that had welcomed the crew for 5 peaceful months gradually disappeared into the distance. Many sailors stood silently watching until the coastline vanished below the horizon. For some, it was simply another departure. For others, it felt like losing an entire future. Life aboard changed almost immediately. The relaxed atmosphere that had developed during the stay ashore disappeared. Naval routine returned. The bells marked the watches once again. Orders echoed across the deck. Work resumed from sunrise until sunset. Hammocks replaced comfortable shelters on land. Fresh tropical meals gave way to preserved provisions. For officers, responsibility increased. For ordinary sailors, so did discipline. Bligh expected the same standards he had enforced before reaching Tahiti. He likely believed this entirely reasonable. The mission remained unfinished. The breadfruit plants still had to reach the Caribbean alive. Every member of the crew had accepted naval service, knowing discipline would always accompany it. Yet people are not machines. 5 months of comparative freedom had changed attitudes aboard the ship. Simple orders that might once have been accepted without complaint now felt restrictive. Small disagreements carried greater emotional weight. The contrast between life on Tahiti and life aboard the Bounty became impossible to ignore. Even tiny frustrations grew larger. A correction from an officer, delayed meal, an uncomfortable watch in bad weather. Each reminder of naval life also reminded many sailors of what they had just left behind. Bligh himself may not have fully appreciated how dramatically those months ashore had altered morale. His journals continued focusing on navigation, supplies, and the condition of the breadfruit plants. He remained the same disciplined officer he had always been. The crew, however, was no longer quite the same crew. During the first weeks after departure, the Bounty sailed westward through the islands of the South Pacific. Weather generally favored the voyage. The sea remained comparatively calm. Navigation presented few unusual difficulties. From a purely nautical perspective, everything seemed to be progressing well. Beneath the surface, though, relationships were beginning to shift. Bligh's sharp criticism continued. When dissatisfied, he openly questioned the judgment of officers. Several surviving testimonies from later courts-martial describe moments when Fletcher Christian found himself the target of these public reprimands. Historians continue debating the exact seriousness of these incidents. Some later writers exaggerated them dramatically. Others minimized them. What seems reasonably well supported is that Bligh increasingly criticized Christian over relatively small matters connected with supplies, coconuts, and shipboard responsibilities. One disagreement involved missing coconuts. Bligh suspected that some had been taken without permission. Unable to identify the responsible individuals, he expressed his anger toward Christian and other officers responsible for supervising stores. Christian insisted he had done nothing wrong. Bligh remained unconvinced. The exchange embarrassed Christian in front of others. Another disagreement followed not long afterward. Again, Bligh questioned Christian's attention to duty. Again, the criticism occurred publicly. Modern readers sometimes underestimate the importance of personal honor in the 18th century. Among naval officers, reputation mattered enormously. To be publicly accused of negligence by one's commanding officer could leave lasting resentment. Whether Bligh intended humiliation is impossible to determine. He may simply have believed firm criticism encouraged better performance. Christian experienced it differently. According to later testimony, these repeated confrontations deeply affected him. The cheerful, confident officer who had left Tahiti began withdrawing into himself. Several shipmates later recalled that he appeared unusually quiet. Others remembered him pacing the deck alone. His behavior suggested someone struggling internally. Exactly what thoughts occupied his mind remains unknown. No diary survives to answer that question. Some historians believe he considered leaving the ship at the next opportunity. Others argue that he contemplated escaping alone on a small raft, rather than leading any organized rebellion. The evidence remains incomplete. What is certain is that Christian had reached a point of profound dissatisfaction. He found himself caught between two incompatible worlds. One represented duty, naval hierarchy, and obedience. The other remained behind on Tahiti, a life of warmth, companionship, and comparative freedom. The distance between those worlds grew greater with every mile the Bounty sailed. Meanwhile, Bligh focused almost entirely on completing the expedition. The breadfruit plants remained healthy. The ship continued making steady progress. Nothing in his official journal suggests he believed mutiny was imminent. That confidence was understandable. Mutiny was among the rarest and most dangerous crimes in naval service. Most captains served entire careers without experiencing anything remotely similar. Bligh had every reason to believe his command remained secure. Yet somewhere aboard the small wooden ship, thoughts that had once seemed impossible were beginning to take shape. Not as a carefully planned conspiracy. Not yet. But as quiet conversations, private frustrations, and dangerous possibilities that would soon change the lives of everyone on board forever. As HMS Bounty continued westward across the South Pacific, the distance from Tahiti increased with every sunrise. The island's mountains had long since disappeared below the horizon, but they had not disappeared from the minds of many aboard the ship. A sailor could look in any direction and see only the endless ocean, yet still remember the cool streams flowing through Tahitian valleys, the scent of breadfruit roasting over open fires, the laughter of families gathered beneath palm trees, and evenings that passed without the sharp commands of naval routine. Memory has a remarkable way of making pleasant places seem even more perfect once they are gone. For several members of the crew, Tahiti was slowly becoming less of a real place and more of an ideal one. Meanwhile, life aboard Bounty returned to the familiar rhythm of an 18th-century voyage. The ship rose and fell gently with the swells. The creaking timbers had become so familiar that most sailors barely noticed them anymore. Every rope had its purpose. Every sail required attention. Every watch followed another in an endless cycle that continued day and night without interruption. There were no weekends. There were no holidays. The sea paid no attention to calendars. Lieutenant William Bligh remained entirely focused on completing the mission entrusted to him by the Admiralty. The breadfruit plants demanded constant care. Fresh water had to be rationed carefully. The pots required regular inspection. Salt spray had to be washed away before it damaged the delicate leaves. To an outside observer, it may have seemed strange that so much attention was devoted to plants while hardened sailors continued their ordinary routines. Yet the success or failure of the expedition rested upon those living cargoes. Without healthy breadfruit plants, the voyage would be judged a failure regardless of how skillfully the ship had crossed the world's oceans. Bligh understood that responsibility better than anyone else aboard. His standards therefore remained as demanding as ever. If he noticed carelessness, he corrected it immediately. If supplies appeared to be disappearing, he investigated. If officers failed to meet his expectations, he said so plainly. The surviving evidence suggests that Bligh's temper became increasingly sharp during these weeks. Not because of a single dramatic event, but because of repeated frustrations that seemed minor when viewed individually. A missing item, an overlooked duty, a misunderstanding about provisions. Each incident added another layer of irritation. Fletcher Christian found himself receiving more of these criticisms than before. One exchange appears to have left a particularly deep impression. Bligh questioned Christian's supervision over supplies and suggested negligence on his part. Christian denied any wrongdoing. The disagreement quickly became personal. According to testimony later given during investigations, Christian felt that his commander no longer trusted him. Whether Bligh truly had lost confidence is impossible to know. His journal does not reveal his private thoughts. But from Christian's perspective, the relationship that had once been built on mutual respect now seemed badly damaged. Other officers noticed changes as well. Christian no longer appeared as relaxed or cheerful as he had during the stay on Tahiti. Several companions later remembered him speaking of his unhappiness. One account suggested that he complained he had been treated like a man without honor. Another recalled him expressing despair about the future. Such recollections must always be read carefully. Most were written after the mutiny, when memories could easily have been influenced by later events. Even so, they paint a broadly consistent picture. Christian was becoming emotionally isolated. He continued performing his duties. He obeyed orders. Outwardly, nothing extraordinary had happened. Inwardly, however, something was changing. The Bounty herself gave no hint that history was approaching. The weather remained generally favorable. Trade winds filled the sails. Flying fish skipped across the waves. Occasionally dolphins raced alongside the bow, seeming almost to play with the ship as it moved steadily through the blue Pacific. Nature remained peaceful. Human relationships did not. During quiet hours, sailors gathered in small groups whenever work allowed. Conversation often returned to Tahiti. Someone remembered a welcoming family. Another recalled a feast. Another wondered aloud whether life on the island had been happier than life under naval discipline. These conversations were not necessarily acts of rebellion. People naturally spoke about places they had enjoyed. Yet every shared memory reinforced the growing contrast between what they had left behind and what lay ahead. Ahead waited months more at sea. Ahead waited the difficult passage to the Caribbean. Ahead waited the return to Britain for some, and continued naval service for others. For men who had briefly experienced a very different way of living, that future no longer seemed especially attractive. Modern historians generally reject the old romantic idea that the mutiny happened simply because the crew wished to remain in paradise. The reality was more complicated. Personal relationships, leadership style, months of accumulated tension, questions of honor, the emotional impact of leaving Tahiti. All these elements combined gradually rather than separately. No single cause explains what happened. Instead, the situation resembled a rope woven from many smaller strands. Each strand alone was not enough. Together they became remarkably strong. Around this time, later testimony suggests that Fletcher Christian briefly considered leaving the ship by himself. Some accounts describe him thinking about constructing a small raft and attempting to reach an island alone rather than continuing under Bligh's command. Whether he truly intended such a desperate journey cannot be proven. The Pacific covered immense distances. A lone man on a small raft would have faced almost impossible odds of survival. Perhaps the idea represented frustration rather than a genuine plan. Perhaps it revealed how trapped Christian felt. Whatever the truth, it demonstrates that his thoughts had moved far beyond ordinary disagreement with a superior officer. The possibility of abandoning the voyage had entered his mind. Yet abandoning the voyage alone was one thing. Convincing others to join him would be something entirely different. Mutiny carried enormous risks. Failure almost certainly meant execution. Even success offered no guarantee of safety. The Royal Navy would pursue anyone who seized one of His Majesty's ships. Every sailor understood that reality. Few would gamble their lives without extraordinary reasons. And still, over the following days, quiet conversations began taking place. Not in large gatherings. Not in dramatic secret meetings hidden below deck. Simply a few trusted men speaking softly where others could not easily overhear. No written plan survives. No detailed record tells us exactly who first spoke the dangerous words. History only reveals the outcome. The idea that once seemed unthinkable slowly became discussable. Discussable became imaginable. And imaginable before long would become real. The dawn that would forever define the names of William Bligh and Fletcher Christian was now only a matter of days away. The Pacific Ocean remained calm. Gentle trade winds pushed HMS Bounty steadily westward, and the ship continued her voyage much as she had every day since leaving Tahiti. To anyone watching from another vessel, nothing would have appeared unusual. The sails were properly trimmed. The officers supervised their watches. The crew carried out their duties. Outwardly, order still existed. Beneath that appearance, however, confidence was beginning to fracture. The days after leaving Tahiti had become increasingly uncomfortable for Fletcher Christian. His responsibilities remained the same, but his relationship with Lieutenant William Bligh no longer resembled the partnership that had existed at the beginning of the expedition. Bligh still relied upon Christian to perform important duties. He still trusted him with watches and navigation. Yet when mistakes or shortages occurred, Christian increasingly found himself criticized before other officers and sailors. Bligh likely believed that immediate correction preserved discipline. Christian interpreted those moments differently. To a gentleman serving as an officer in the 18th century Royal Navy, public respect carried enormous importance. A reputation carefully built over years could be damaged by repeated accusations, even if those accusations involved relatively small matters. Whether Bligh intended to humiliate him remains impossible to know. The surviving records tell us what happened. They cannot fully reveal what either man was thinking. Christian's own later statements suggest that he had become deeply unhappy. Several crew members would eventually testify that he spoke of leaving the ship altogether. Others remembered him expressing despair over his treatment. Some accounts even describe him sleeping very little during those final days before the mutiny. Again, historians approach these recollections carefully. Memories recorded after dramatic events are never perfect. Even so, they consistently portray a man under considerable emotional strain. Life aboard the Bounty continued according to routine. The breadfruit plants demanded constant attention. Every morning, sailors carried fresh water to the carefully arranged pots secured on deck. Bligh inspected them regularly. The plants remained healthy. Ironically, the expedition itself was progressing successfully. The very objective that had justified the entire voyage was finally within reach. Yet success in one area could not repair damaged relationships. As the ship approached the Friendly Islands, known today as much of the Kingdom of Tonga, the crew anticipated opportunities to gather additional food and water. These islands had already become familiar to European navigators through the voyages of Captain James Cook. Bligh hoped to replenish supplies before continuing across the Pacific. The stop would prove more complicated than expected. When Bounty reached the vicinity of the islands, local canoes soon approached. Trade began peacefully. Fresh fruit, coconuts, and other provisions were exchanged for European goods. Such encounters had become common during Pacific voyages. Most passed without serious difficulty. This one did not. During one exchange, several islanders attempted to take items from the ship. Whether these actions reflected theft as understood by the British or different local customs regarding exchange remains debated. Whatever the explanation, Bligh reacted quickly. He ordered the ship prepared for possible conflict. The situation remained tense. Fortunately, no major violence followed, but the incident added another layer of stress to an already uneasy atmosphere aboard the vessel. For Bligh, it reinforced the importance of strict discipline. For some members of the crew, it became another exhausting interruption in a voyage that seemed to grow longer with every passing week. Meanwhile, Christian's state of mind continued to deteriorate. According to testimony later presented during official investigations, he privately confided in a small number of trusted shipmates. Among them were men who had also grown attached to Tahiti. Some had formed families there. Some dreaded returning to ordinary naval life. Others simply admired Christian and respected his abilities. At this stage, historians cannot say with certainty that a detailed plan already existed. The evidence does not support the image created by many novels and films of weeks spent secretly organizing an elaborate conspiracy. Instead, events appear to have developed remarkably quickly. The discussions were limited. The decisions were made over only a short period. This makes the mutiny all the more extraordinary. One of the most famous acts of rebellion in maritime history was not necessarily the product of months of careful planning. It may instead have emerged from rapidly growing frustration among a relatively small group of men. Christian himself seems to have struggled with the decision. Nothing in the surviving evidence suggests he had long dreamed of becoming a rebel. On the contrary, he had willingly joined the expedition under a commander he previously respected. He had performed his duties competently. He had earned promotion and responsibility. Only after Tahiti, and only after repeated disagreements with Bligh, did the situation begin to change. During these final days before the mutiny, the atmosphere aboard Bounty became increasingly difficult to describe. There was no open rebellion. No shouted arguments echoed across the deck. The watches continued. Meals were served. The ship sailed on. And yet, beneath that ordinary routine, trust had quietly begun to disappear. Bligh remained unaware of how serious matters had become. His journal records navigation, weather, provisions, and daily activities with the same careful precision he had maintained throughout the voyage. Nothing suggests that he expected immediate danger from his own officers. That confidence was understandable. Mutiny against a commissioned officer was exceptionally rare. Royal Navy discipline, combined with the severe legal consequences of rebellion, discouraged such actions. Few captains ever experienced anything comparable. Bligh had little reason to believe his own ship would become the exception. The men who would eventually stand beside Christian also faced enormous uncertainty. If they acted, there would be no turning back. Should the attempt fail, execution almost certainly awaited them. If it succeeded, they would become fugitives pursued by the British Empire across the world's oceans. Some hesitated. Some refused to participate. Others remained undecided almost until the final hours. History often makes dramatic events appear inevitable. In reality, they rarely are. Small decisions made by individuals in moments of uncertainty can alter the course of lives, nations, and history itself. On the evening of April 27, 1789, HMS Bounty continued sailing peacefully through the Pacific. The stars appeared one by one above the masts. The watches changed as usual. Most of the crew settled into their hammocks, expecting another ordinary night at sea. Lieutenant William Bligh retired to his cabin believing the expedition remained under his command. Fletcher Christian also lay down for the night. By sunrise, one of those men would no longer command the Bounty, and the other would become one of the most famous and most debated mutineers in history. The night of April 27, 1789 passed with remarkable calm. There were no violent storms. No enemy ships appeared on the horizon. No warning bells echoed across the deck. The Pacific remained quiet beneath a sky filled with stars, while HMS Bounty continued her steady course through the darkness. To most of the crew, it was simply another ordinary night at sea. Below deck, sailors rested in their hammocks after another long day of work. Some slept deeply, exhausted by months of constant duty. Others drifted in and out of sleep as the familiar sounds of the ship surrounded them. The steady creaking of timbers, the gentle splash of waves against the hull, and the occasional footsteps of men standing the night watch. Lieutenant William Bligh retired to his cabin believing that the voyage, despite recent disagreements, remained firmly under his command. Nothing in his journal suggests he expected immediate danger from his own officers. He had faced storms. He had crossed oceans. He had navigated some of the world's most difficult waters. But the greatest threat now rested only a few yards away. Somewhere else aboard the ship, Fletcher Christian remained awake much longer. No surviving diary records exactly what occupied his thoughts during those final hours. Historians can only reconstruct events from later testimony and official investigations. What appears reasonably clear is that Christian had reached a point from which he believed there was no easy return. Whether he viewed mutiny as his only remaining choice, or whether he simply acted in a moment of emotional desperation, continues to be debated. The evidence does not provide a simple answer. Before dawn on April 28, 1789, Christian quietly began moving through the ship. He approached a small number of trusted companions. Not everyone agreed immediately. Several men refused to participate. Others chose to remain neutral, uncertain which side would ultimately prevail. The famous mutiny was not supported by the entire crew. That fact is often forgotten. Of the 46 men aboard the Bounty, only part of the crew actively joined Christian. Many others remained loyal to Bligh or simply found themselves caught between two groups before they fully understood what was happening. The operation unfolded with surprising speed. Armed with muskets, cutlasses, and bayonets, Christian and several supporters quietly secured key areas of the vessel. The element of surprise proved essential. Noise had to be kept to an absolute minimum. Every second increased the risk that loyal crew members might organize resistance. Just before sunrise, Christian entered Bligh's cabin. The captain was still asleep. Accounts written afterward describe the sudden confusion. Bligh awoke to find armed men surrounding him. Within moments, he realized something almost unimaginable had occurred. His own ship had been seized. Bligh demanded to know what was happening. Christian reportedly answered with words that have echoed through history, though different witnesses remembered them slightly differently. According to several accounts, Christian declared that he had been driven to this action and could no longer endure his treatment. Whether those were his exact words can never be known with certainty. What cannot be disputed is that command of the Bounty had changed hands. Bligh attempted to reason with the mutineers. He argued. He questioned them. He appealed to their sense of duty. Some of the men appeared deeply uncomfortable. Several later admitted they had not expected the moment to feel so real. Mutiny had always been an abstract possibility. Now it carried the faces of friends and shipmates. Christian himself reportedly appeared agitated rather than triumphant. Witnesses later described him as pale and visibly distressed. This was not the behavior of a man celebrating victory. It was the behavior of someone stepping into an uncertain future from which there could be no return. Meanwhile, confusion spread throughout the ship. Crew members rushed onto the deck, many still uncertain what was happening. Some instinctively moved toward Bligh. Others remained frozen. A few quickly sided with Christian. One by one, choices were made that would define the rest of their lives. Bligh called upon loyal sailors to resist. Several wished to help him, but they faced armed mutineers who already controlled the ship. The opportunity for organized resistance disappeared almost immediately. Remarkably, despite the extraordinary tension, very little blood was shed. No major battle erupted aboard the Bounty. No prolonged struggle took place. The mutiny succeeded largely because it happened so quickly and because surprise prevented effective opposition. Christian's supporters secured the weapons. The loyal officers found themselves overwhelmed before they could organize. The absence of widespread violence remains one of the most striking features of the event. History often remembers dramatic battles. The mutiny aboard the Bounty succeeded through speed, confusion, and divided loyalties rather than open combat. As daylight slowly spread across the Pacific, the full consequences became impossible to ignore. Bligh was no longer commander of his ship. Christian now controlled a Royal Navy vessel carrying valuable government property and hundreds of breadfruit plants. The mutineers immediately faced an enormous question. What should they do with Captain Bligh? Executing him would almost certainly make reconciliation impossible. Keeping him aboard created the constant risk that loyal crew members might attempt to restore his command. Releasing him offered no guarantee of safety. Yet it also avoided immediate bloodshed. Christian made his decision. Bligh would not be killed. Instead, he would be placed into one of the ship's open launches together with those who chose, or were permitted, to remain loyal to him. It was an extraordinary gamble. The small boat measured only about 23 feet in length, had no deck. It offered almost no protection from storms. The nearest European settlements lay thousands of miles away across some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. Many would have considered such a voyage impossible. As preparations began, loyal crew members gathered what supplies they could: food, water, navigation instruments, few essential tools. Every item loaded into the launch might determine whether its occupant survived. Above them, the Bounty drifted quietly beneath the morning sky. The sea remained calm. The birds circled overhead. Nature itself seemed completely unaware that one of the most famous mutinies in maritime history had just unfolded on the deck below. Within only a few more hours, William Bligh and 18 loyal men would be cast adrift upon the vast Pacific Ocean, beginning a journey that many historians consider one of the greatest feats of open-boat navigation ever accomplished. Morning light spread slowly across the Pacific as the consequences of the mutiny became impossible to reverse. HMS Bounty still floated peacefully upon the gentle swells, her sails stirring in the warm trade wind just as they had the day before. From a distance, another ship might have seen nothing unusual. There was no smoke, no battle, no damaged rigging. Yet everything aboard had changed. Fletcher Christian now stood where Lieutenant William Bligh had stood only hours earlier. Bligh, meanwhile, was no longer captain of the ship entrusted to him by the British Admiralty. The mutineers had made their decision. Now they had to decide the fate of the men who remained loyal to Bligh. Killing them would have removed any immediate threat. History records many mutinies that ended in bloodshed. The Bounty, however, followed a different path. Christian chose not to execute his former commander. Whether this decision came from compassion, respect, uncertainty, or simple practicality has been debated ever since. What survives in the historical record is the outcome itself. Bligh and the loyal men would be set adrift. Preparations began immediately. The ship's launch, a small open boat approximately 23 feet long, was lowered into the sea. Compared with the Bounty, it seemed incredibly fragile. It possessed no deck beneath which men could shelter. No cabin protected them from tropical rain or relentless sunlight. Every wave would splash directly into the boat. Every storm would strike them without mercy. One by one, the loyal crew members climbed down. Some did so quietly. Others exchanged final words with friends who had chosen the opposite side. Those moments must have been deeply painful. Many of these men had sailed together for more than a year. They had survived storms near Cape Horn, crossed enormous oceans, and shared the hardships of one of the longest voyages imaginable. Now they stood divided forever. In total, 19 men occupied the launch. William Bligh, his clerk, several loyal petty officers, sailors who either refused to join the mutiny or whom Christian ordered to leave because they were considered too loyal to remain aboard. Not everyone who wished to accompany Bligh could fit into the crowded boat. Likewise, not every man who remained aboard the Bounty necessarily supported the mutiny wholeheartedly. Some found themselves trapped by circumstance. The division of the crew reflected confusion as much as conviction. Before casting off, Bligh requested additional supplies. Christian allowed several essential items to be transferred. Approximately 150 pounds of bread, some salted pork, quantity of water, a small amount of rum and wine, basic tools. Most importantly, Bligh received his sextant and a pocket watch. These instruments would later prove invaluable. Without them, accurate navigation across thousands of miles of open ocean would have been almost impossible. Ironically, the mutineers did not provide him with charts. Bligh would have to rely largely upon memory, previous experience, and remarkable navigational skill. The launch was dangerously overloaded. 19 men occupied a space never intended for so many passengers on such a long voyage. There was barely enough room to move. Every shift in weight affected the balance of the boat. Every wave demanded careful attention. As the final ropes were released, the launch slowly drifted away from HMS Bounty. The separation happened quietly. No cannon fired. No dramatic farewell echoed across the water. The distance simply widened. Bligh looked back at the ship that had been his command. Christian remained aboard the vessel that had become his only hope of survival. Neither man would ever see the other again. The Bounty gradually sailed away. Her white sails became smaller against the endless blue horizon. Eventually she disappeared completely. Bligh and his companions were alone. Around them stretched the largest ocean on Earth. Ahead lay thousands of miles of uncertain water. The nearest European settlement was far beyond the horizon. Most observers would have considered their chances of survival almost non-existent. Yet Bligh refused to surrender to despair. His response during those first hours revealed why fellow navigators had long respected his abilities. Instead of dwelling upon what had been lost, he immediately began organizing the men and their supplies. Everything had to be counted. Food would be rationed with extraordinary care. Water would be distributed in measured quantities. Every unnecessary movement wasted energy. Every careless decision threatened lives. Leadership mattered more than ever. Bligh addressed the men calmly. Panic would solve nothing. Discipline remained essential even in the smallest of boats. The sea did not care whether they possessed a Royal Navy ship or only a crowded launch. Survival depended entirely upon judgment and cooperation. Bligh's first objective was Tofua, one of the islands in the Tonga group. He hoped to obtain fresh water and additional food before attempting the vastly longer journey toward the Dutch settlement at Timor. At that moment, however, Timor remained little more than a distant possibility. The immediate concern was surviving the next few days. The launch moved slowly across the Pacific. Each man held an oar whenever needed. Others bailed water constantly. The tropical sun quickly became exhausting. There was almost no shade. Salt spray coated their clothing. The cramped conditions left little opportunity for rest. Even sleeping became difficult. Yet despite these hardships, morale remained surprisingly steady during the first stage of the voyage. The men trusted Bligh. Many had served with him long enough to recognize his remarkable navigational abilities. If anyone could somehow guide a small open boat across immense distances, it was probably William Bligh. As evening approached, the launch reached the vicinity of Tofua. From the sea, the island appeared promising. Green vegetation covered the slopes. Fresh streams likely flowed from the hills. Food might be obtained through trade with local inhabitants. After the ordeal of the mutiny, the site offered genuine hope. Bligh planned to land cautiously. He understood from previous Pacific voyages that respectful relations with island communities usually produced successful exchanges. Nevertheless, caution remained necessary. The men were exhausted. They possessed few weapons. Their overloaded boat offered little protection if difficulties arose. What began as a hopeful attempt to gather supplies would soon become the most dangerous moment of the entire open boat voyage. Before the remarkable navigation that would make William Bligh famous around the world could even begin, he and his loyal companions would first have to survive an unexpected tragedy on the shores of Tofua, one that would remind them just how vulnerable 19 men in a small boat truly were. The small launch drifted toward the island of Tofua with cautious optimism. After the shock of the mutiny, the sight of land offered something the 19 men desperately needed: hope. The green slopes rising above the sea suggested fresh water, fruit, and perhaps an opportunity to recover before attempting the unimaginable voyage that still lay ahead. William Bligh knew they could not survive long on the supplies they carried. The bread, pork, and water loaded into the launch had to last as long as possible, but they were nowhere near enough for a journey of several thousand miles. Fresh provisions were essential. As the boat approached the shore, the men could see people gathering along the beach. Islanders watched the unfamiliar visitors with understandable curiosity. European ships had visited parts of Tonga before, including during Captain James Cook's voyages, but every new arrival required careful judgment. Neither side fully understood the intentions of the other. Bligh decided to proceed peacefully. Trade rather than force had been the successful approach throughout much of the Pacific. The men landed carefully. For a time, everything appeared encouraging. They searched for water. Some attempted to communicate through gestures and a few words learned during earlier voyages. Small exchanges took place. The atmosphere remained calm enough that Bligh believed they might safely spend the night before continuing their journey. But as the hours passed, more and more islanders gathered. The number steadily increased. Bligh noticed the change. First, it seemed only natural. Visitors attracted attention. Soon, however, the growing crowd began to make him uneasy. His group was badly outnumbered. The launch contained almost everything they possessed. If it were lost, there would be no second chance. Bligh quietly instructed his men to remain alert. The situation grew increasingly tense. Historical accounts differ in some details, largely because the surviving descriptions come from the exhausted British sailors themselves. What is clear is that Bligh concluded remaining ashore had become too dangerous. He ordered the launch prepared for immediate departure. The loyal crew quickly gathered what supplies they could and hurried back toward the boat. As they attempted to push off from the shore, the atmosphere changed dramatically. A crowd of islanders surrounded them. Stones began flying. The attack came suddenly. Large rocks struck the overloaded launch. The men struggled desperately to shove the boat into deeper water before it became trapped against the beach. Several sailors pushed with all their strength while others tried to fend off the attackers. The confusion lasted only moments. Then tragedy struck. Quartermaster John Norton was hit and overwhelmed before he could climb back aboard. Despite desperate attempts to help him, the launch was already drifting away. The surviving crew watched helplessly as Norton was killed on the shore. They could do nothing. Returning would almost certainly have meant losing the entire party. Bligh later wrote with deep sadness about the loss. It was the only death among the loyal men during the extraordinary voyage that followed, yet it remained a painful reminder of how fragile their situation truly was. Now only 18 men remained. The launch finally reached deeper water. Stones continued splashing into the sea around them until the distance became too great. Silence gradually returned. No one spoke for several minutes. The realization settled heavily over the exhausted crew. They had escaped the mutiny. Now they had narrowly escaped another disaster. And they had lost one of their companions. Bligh faced an immediate decision. Returning to any nearby island carried enormous risk. The men possessed little with which to defend themselves. Every landing could end exactly as Tofua had. He therefore abandoned the idea of making additional stops among the islands. Instead, he made one of the boldest navigational decisions in maritime history. He would attempt to sail directly to the Dutch settlement at Timor. The distance was approximately 3,600 nautical miles, more than 6,500 kilometers. In a fully equipped ship, such a voyage demanded skill. In a crowded open launch, it seemed almost impossible. Few people in the 18th century would have believed such a journey could succeed. The launch had no proper shelter, no charts, very limited food, very limited water, no margin for serious mistakes. Yet Bligh believed it could be done. His confidence did not come from optimism alone. It came from years of experience. He had sailed much of the Pacific with Captain James Cook. He knew the prevailing winds. He remembered islands, reefs, and coastlines from earlier voyages. Most importantly, he trusted his own ability to navigate using the sun, stars, compass, sextant, and careful calculations. The men accepted his decision. There was no realistic alternative. The launch turned westward. Ahead stretched weeks upon weeks of open ocean. Bligh immediately introduced extremely strict rationing. Every ounce of food mattered. Each man received only tiny portions of bread. Water was measured with extraordinary care. The quantities were so small that hunger became a constant companion. Thirst proved even worse. Under the tropical sun, lips cracked, tongue swelled, salt covered their skin. Fresh water became more precious than anything else in the world. Bligh understood that discipline alone offered hope. He insisted upon fairness. No favorites. Every man received exactly the same ration, including Bligh himself. His willingness to endure the same hardships strengthened confidence among the crew. Leadership in those conditions depended not merely upon giving orders but upon sharing every sacrifice. During the long hours of rowing and sailing, conversation often faded. The men conserved their energy. Some stared silently toward the horizon. Others thought about families they might never see again. No one could know whether rescue, survival, or death awaited them. Each sunset felt like a small victory. Each sunrise brought another uncertain day. Meanwhile, somewhere far behind them, Fletcher Christian remained aboard the Bounty. He now faced a very different problem. Taking control of the ship had been only the beginning. He still needed to decide where the mutineers could possibly go. Returning to Britain meant certain arrest. Remaining in familiar Pacific ports risked discovery. Every choice carried enormous danger. For both groups, the loyal men in the launch and the mutineers aboard the Bounty, the morning of April 28 had ended one chapter of history. Now two entirely separate stories were unfolding across the Pacific Ocean. One would become celebrated as one of the greatest feats of open-boat navigation ever recorded. The other would become a desperate search for a place where the British Empire might never find them. The open launch rose and fell with the endless rhythm of the Pacific. Behind William Bligh and his 18 companions lay Tofua, where they had narrowly escaped with their lives and lost Quartermaster John Norton. Ahead stretched more than 3,600 nautical miles of ocean before the Dutch settlement at Timor, a distance so great that few sailors of the 18th century would have believed it could be crossed in a vessel so small. Yet there was no turning back. Bligh settled into a routine that would govern every hour of the voyage. Discipline, he believed, was no less important in an open boat than aboard a Royal Navy ship. Each morning began with an inspection of their precious supplies. The bread was carefully divided. Water was measured with extraordinary precision. Nothing could be wasted. A careless hand spilling even a small amount of fresh water might endanger every life aboard. The daily ration was painfully small. Each man received only about an ounce of bread at a time, along with a tiny portion of water. The amount barely eased hunger. It certainly did not satisfy thirst. The tropical sun beat down relentlessly. During the middle of the day, the heat became almost unbearable. Salt dried on their faces. Their lips cracked. Their clothing remained stiff with seawater. Even simple movement required effort. Still, no one complained openly. The men understood the mathematics of survival. If they consumed too much too early, they would have nothing left when they needed it most. Bligh himself accepted exactly the same ration as every other man. He did not reserve larger portions because he was the commanding officer. That decision mattered greatly. In desperate circumstances, fairness builds trust. The crew could see that their captain expected no special privilege. His authority rested not only on rank but also on personal example. Whenever possible, Bligh navigated using the sun. Holding his sextant carefully despite the movement of the crowded launch, he measured the angle between the horizon and the midday sun. Without proper charts, he relied heavily upon memory. Years spent sailing with Captain James Cook had taught him the geography of the Pacific in remarkable detail. He remembered islands. He remembered currents. He remembered prevailing winds. Those memories now became as valuable as food itself. At night, the stars guided them. The clear Pacific sky revealed familiar constellations. To experienced navigators, the heavens formed a dependable map long before modern instruments existed. Bligh studied them carefully. Every correct observation increased the chances of reaching Timor. Every mistake could send the launch hundreds of miles off course. The men rowed when necessary. When favorable winds arrived, they raised a small sail. Each method conserved strength in different ways. No one possessed much energy to spare. Sleep came only in short, uncomfortable periods. 19 men had once crowded the launch. Now 18 remained, and even that number left almost no room to stretch. Their bodies ached constantly. Rain occasionally brought relief from thirst. Whenever dark clouds gathered overhead, the men eagerly spread clothing, hats, and containers to catch every possible drop of fresh water. A sudden shower transformed despair into gratitude. Nature could be cruel, could also be unexpectedly generous. The sea itself provided occasional encouragement. Flying fish sometimes landed inside the launch during the night. To exhausted sailors, such accidents became valuable gifts. The fish were quickly collected and shared. Every small meal strengthened the crew for another day. Birds occasionally appeared overhead. Their presence reminded Bligh that islands might be somewhere beyond the horizon, even if they remained out of sight. Still, he avoided unnecessary landings. The tragedy at Tofua had demonstrated the risks involved. His goal remained unchanged. Reach Timor. Do not stop unless absolutely necessary. Meanwhile, far away aboard HMS Bounty, Fletcher Christian faced an entirely different challenge. Winning control of the ship had proved easier than deciding its future. The mutineers now possessed a Royal Navy vessel, but they had no safe destination. Returning to Britain guaranteed arrest and trial. Entering a major European port elsewhere carried almost the same danger. Even familiar Pacific islands offered no certainty. News traveled surprisingly quickly through naval networks. Any ship recognized as His Majesty's Bounty would attract attention. Christian therefore gathered the men to discuss their options. Not everyone agreed. Some wished to return to Tahiti. Several had left behind wives, companions, or close friends there. Life on the island remained deeply attractive. Others feared that Tahiti had become too well known to British explorers. If the Royal Navy searched for the mutineers, Tahiti would surely be one of the first places examined. Different opinions emerged. The mutineers were united in overthrowing Bligh. They were far less united about what should happen next. Christian himself appeared increasingly burdened by responsibility. Leading a mutiny required one kind of courage. Deciding the future of more than 24 lives required another. Historical accounts written by surviving mutineers suggest that Christian did not behave like a man celebrating victory. Instead, he often seemed thoughtful, anxious, and uncertain. The weight of command had shifted onto his shoulders almost overnight. Every decision now belonged to him. Back in the launch, William Bligh maintained careful notes whenever circumstances allowed. Despite the hardship, he continued recording distances, weather conditions, and observations about the voyage. Those records survive today and provide historians with one of the most remarkable first-hand accounts of maritime survival ever written. They reveal remarkably little self-pity. Instead, Bligh focused upon practical matters. The next course, the next ration, the next day's navigation. His attention remained fixed upon keeping 18 exhausted men alive. Day after day, the launch continued westward. The ocean seemed endless. Some mornings began beneath brilliant sunshine. Others brought towering waves and heavy rain. The men accepted every change without complaint because they had no choice. The Pacific determined the rhythm of their lives. Bligh determined only how they responded. As another sunset painted the horizon in deep shades of orange and gold, the exhausted sailors watched darkness slowly cover the sea. The stars emerged one by one. The launch continued forward. Somewhere beyond that vast darkness lay Timor. Whether they would ever reach it remained unknown. But with every careful calculation and every mile gained, William Bligh was proving why generations of historians would later remember this journey as one of the greatest examples of navigation, endurance, and leadership ever accomplished in a small open boat. Each sunrise over the Pacific brought the same quiet question. Could 18 exhausted men survive one more day? There was no calendar hanging inside the launch. No comfortable cabin marked the passing weeks. Time was measured differently now. One ration of bread. One careful drink of water. One successful day of navigation. Then another. And another. The little boat pressed onward through an ocean so vast that it seemed impossible any human could truly cross it without a proper ship. Yet William Bligh refused to think in terms of the entire journey. Instead, he concentrated on the next calculation, the next course, the next sunrise. It was a practical way of leading men through an almost unimaginable situation. If they thought constantly about the thousands of miles still ahead, despair might overwhelm them. If they focused only on today's work, tomorrow might eventually arrive. Bligh's experience under Captain James Cook now became invaluable. Cook's voyages had not only expanded European knowledge of the Pacific, they had trained officers like Bligh to observe everything. The color of the sea, the direction of the swell, the behavior of seabirds, the movement of clouds. Each detail could reveal something about nearby land or changing weather. Nothing was ignored. Nothing was considered too small to matter. The launch itself demanded constant attention. Water collected in the bottom whenever waves splashed over the sides. Men bailed continuously using whatever containers they possessed. Even a small amount of extra water added dangerous weight. If the sea grew rough, every man understood his responsibility without being reminded. They had become a single working unit. No one could afford selfishness. One careless action threatened everyone. The weather remained unpredictable. Some afternoons passed beneath bright tropical skies. Then, without much warning, dark clouds gathered. Heavy rain swept across the ocean. Strong winds churned the surface into steep waves. The overloaded launch climbed each swell before crashing into the next valley of water. Every movement demanded balance. Every man gripped the boat tightly. A single large wave breaking over the side could easily swamp the launch. The men often ended these storms soaked from head to foot. Yet rain also brought hope. Fresh water fell directly from the sky. Whenever possible, clothing, hats, and containers were spread out to catch every precious drop. The sailors drank carefully. They filled whatever small vessels remained available. For a few brief hours after good rainfall, thirst eased. No one wasted the opportunity. Food, however, remained desperately limited. The bread continued shrinking day by day. Bligh maintained strict equality. Nobody received larger portions. Nobody secretly saved better food. The captain lived exactly as the crew lived. That example strengthened confidence in his leadership. Several sailors later remembered how calm Bligh remained even during the most difficult moments. He rarely allowed fear to become visible. Whether he experienced private doubts is another question entirely. His journal suggests that he understood the enormous danger perfectly well. But leaders often recognize that visible confidence can become as important as practical skill. If the captain abandoned hope, the crew might follow. So Bligh remained focused, measured, steady. The men drew strength from that consistency. At night, exhaustion made sleep almost irresistible. Yet proper rest remained nearly impossible. The launch offered almost no space. Bodies pressed against one another. Clothing never completely dried. Mosquitoes occasionally appeared whenever they passed near islands. The salt left painful sores wherever skin rubbed against wet fabric. Even turning over required disturbing someone else. Still, they slept whenever they could. The human body adapts remarkably when necessity leaves no alternative. One evening, seabirds began appearing in greater numbers. Their flight patterns caught Bligh's attention immediately. Experienced navigators understood that certain birds rarely traveled far from land. The sight encouraged the crew. Perhaps an island lay somewhere ahead. The next morning, distant clouds seemed unusually stationary along one section of the horizon. Bligh recognized another familiar sign. Large tropical islands often created distinctive cloud formations above their mountains. By afternoon, faint outlines of land slowly emerged. It was one of the islands near the Fiji group. The sight brought mixed emotions. Land meant fresh water might be available. It also meant danger. Reports from earlier European voyages described parts of Fiji as potentially hostile toward unfamiliar visitors. Bligh remembered those accounts. The tragedy at Tofua remained painfully fresh in everyone's memory. He made a careful decision. The launch would remain offshore. No landing. No unnecessary risk. Fresh water would have been welcome. But preserving 18 lives mattered more than improving supplies. The men accepted the decision, though it disappointed many of them. The islands slowly disappeared behind the horizon. The voyage continued. Far away, Fletcher Christian faced decisions of a different kind. The Bounty no longer followed Bligh's carefully planned route toward the Caribbean. Instead, Christian steered back toward Tahiti. Several mutineers strongly favored returning there. They had left behind relationships, friends, and a life they still longed for. Christian eventually agreed. In late May 1789, the Bounty arrived once again at Matavai Bay. The return surprised many Tahitians. Only weeks earlier, the British ship had departed. Now she had returned without Lieutenant Bligh. The explanation could not remain hidden for long. Some mutineers openly admitted what had happened. Others remained cautious. Several members of the crew chose to stay permanently on Tahiti. They believed the island offered their best chance of avoiding British justice. Christian, however, remained uncertain. Tahiti was familiar to European explorers. If the Royal Navy searched for the Bounty, investigators would almost certainly visit the island. Remaining there permanently seemed increasingly dangerous. The mutineers themselves were beginning to divide. Some wished to settle peacefully. Others believed they must continue searching for a more remote refuge. The unity that had existed during the mutiny slowly began to weaken. Back on the open ocean, Bligh's launch continued its remarkable westward journey. The sea stretched endlessly before them. The food continued diminishing. The men grew thinner with each passing day. Yet one thing remained unchanged. Not a single person had suggested surrender. Not one man had proposed abandoning the voyage. Every mile carried them farther from the morning of the mutiny. Every mile carried them closer to a destination that still existed only in William Bligh's calculations and determination. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, Timor waited. And against almost every expectation of the 18th century, the impossible journey was beginning to look just a little more possible. The launch had now been at sea for many days without the protection of a ship. Its 18 occupants had grown accustomed to discomfort in ways they could never have imagined before the mutiny. Hunger no longer arrived in sharp waves. It had become a constant companion. Thirst lingered throughout every hour of the day. The men's faces grew thinner. Their clothing hung more loosely than when they had left the Bounty. Their hands, hardened by years of seamanship, were now swollen from endless exposure to salt water. Even so, William Bligh noticed something encouraging. Despite the hardships, discipline had not broken. The crew continued following instructions without argument. Each man understood that survival depended not on individual strength but on collective effort. If one sailor neglected his duty at the wrong moment, everyone in the launch might pay the price. Every morning began with careful observation. Bligh examined the sky before sunrise. Cloud formations revealed changing weather. The direction of the swell hinted at prevailing winds. He watched seabirds whenever they appeared, noting both their species and the direction in which they flew. To someone unfamiliar with ocean navigation, these details might seem insignificant. To an experienced 18th century navigator, they formed part of a language written across the sea itself. The launch continued westward. Bligh's remarkable memory became more valuable with each passing day. Without detailed charts, he relied upon knowledge gained years earlier during voyages with Captain James Cook. He recalled reefs that could destroy a boat within moments. He remembered islands that offered little chance of safe landing. He mentally reconstructed coastlines he had not seen for years. Few navigators possessed such extraordinary recall. The men trusted those memories with their lives. Storms remained an ever-present danger. One afternoon, dark clouds gathered rapidly along the western horizon. The wind freshened. Within a short time, towering waves surrounded the tiny launch. Rain poured relentlessly. The sea became a chaotic mixture of wind, foam, and crashing water. Every man immediately took his assigned position. Some bailed continuously. Others steadied the mast and sail. Several worked to keep the boat balanced as each wave threatened to roll it sideways. For hours they fought the weather. Water repeatedly flooded into the launch. The men, already exhausted from weeks of hardship, forced themselves to continue bailing without pause. Stopping even briefly would allow too much water to accumulate. The launch survived because no one gave up. By evening, the storm finally began to weaken. Clouds slowly broke apart. The setting sun appeared beneath the retreating rain, casting golden light across the restless sea. The men remained soaked, exhausted, and cold despite the tropical climate. Yet they had survived another trial. Bligh later reflected that storms brought both danger and opportunity. Although rough seas threatened to overwhelm the launch, heavy rain also replenished their supply of fresh water. They carefully collected as much as possible. Every container was filled. Every piece of cloth capable of holding water became useful. The crew drank gratefully. For a brief time, thirst no longer dominated every thought. Simple moments like these transformed morale. Hope rarely arrived through dramatic events. Instead, it appeared quietly. A successful navigation calculation. A rainfall that filled water containers. A flying fish landing unexpectedly in the boat during the night. A favorable wind replacing days of exhausting rowing. Small blessings accumulated. They reminded the crew that survival remained possible. Bligh also paid careful attention to the men's spirits. His journal reveals surprisingly few complaints from the crew. This does not mean suffering was absent. Rather, it suggests the men had accepted their circumstances completely. Complaining could not create more food. It could not shorten the distance to Timor. Energy spent on despair was energy unavailable for survival. Meanwhile, far away in Tahiti, the situation among the mutineers grew increasingly uncertain. When Fletcher Christian returned aboard the Bounty, difficult decisions immediately confronted him. Some of the mutineers wanted nothing more than to remain permanently on the island. Several had established close relationships with Tahitian women. Others had formed friendships with local families. Life appeared peaceful. The climate was welcoming. Food remained abundant. Compared with the rigid structure of naval service, Tahiti still represented freedom. But Christian remained deeply uneasy. He understood something many of his companions preferred not to think about. Tahiti was well known to the Royal Navy. Captain James Cook had visited the island repeatedly. British ships continued crossing the Pacific. If the Admiralty organized a search for the Bounty, Tahiti would almost certainly be investigated. Remaining there might simply postpone capture. The mutineers therefore divided. 16 men eventually chose to stay on Tahiti, believing they could build new lives despite the risks. Christian, however, decided to continue searching for a more isolated refuge. He took with him 8 fellow mutineers, several Tahitian men, women, and children, and prepared to leave once again. Finding a place beyond the reach of the British Empire had become his new mission. The Pacific was vast. Surely somewhere among its countless islands lay a location so remote that no naval vessel would ever arrive. Back in the launch, Bligh knew nothing of these developments. His attention remained fixed entirely upon the sea before him. Each evening he estimated the day's progress. Each morning he adjusted course according to wind and current. The voyage had now become a test not merely of navigation but of endurance. Weeks earlier, many would have judged the journey impossible. Now, mile after mile, the impossible continued unfolding before them. The men had crossed dangerous waters. They had survived storms. They had resisted hunger. Most importantly, they had continued believing their captain's calculations. Somewhere ahead lay the islands of the Dutch East Indies. Beyond them waited Timor. The distance remained enormous. But for the first time since leaving the Bounty, William Bligh could begin to believe that reaching civilization was no longer just a desperate hope. It was becoming a realistic possibility. Day after day, the little launch continued westward across waters that seemed to have no end. The Pacific remained magnificent in its scale. Some mornings began with glassy seas reflecting the pale colors of dawn so perfectly that the horizon almost disappeared. On other days, long rolling swells reminded the 18 men how small they truly were. There was never a moment when they could forget that they occupied nothing more than a heavily loaded open boat in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth. William Bligh continued to guide them with remarkable consistency. Each clear day, he carefully observed the sun with his sextant whenever conditions allowed. At night, when clouds did not hide the heavens, familiar stars confirmed his calculations. Without detailed charts, every observation mattered. The crew watched him closely. Many of the sailors could not perform the complicated mathematical calculations themselves, but they understood what they represented. Every measurement meant direction. Every successful calculation meant hope. Trust in Bligh's navigation grew stronger with each passing day. The food supply, however, continued to shrink. The carefully rationed bread had become hard and dry after weeks of exposure to sea air. Every crumb was collected. Nothing was wasted. If a small piece fell into the bottom of the boat, someone carefully picked it up. There was no such thing as insignificant food anymore. The men ate slowly, hoping to make each tiny portion seem larger than it truly was. Their thoughts often returned to ordinary meals they had once taken for granted. Fresh bread, warm soup, fruit, clean drinking water. Simple comforts became extraordinary in memory. Yet remarkably, the crew maintained discipline. No surviving account records serious arguments over food or water during the voyage. Bligh's insistence upon equal distribution prevented jealousy from taking root. Everyone suffered together. Everyone survived together. The weather offered both encouragement and danger. One afternoon, favorable winds filled the small sail for hours without interruption. The launch covered far more distance than usual. The exhausted crew welcomed every mile gained without additional rowing. Bligh calculated their progress with quiet satisfaction. Good winds could shorten the journey by days. But the Pacific rarely remained generous for long. Not many days later, the wind weakened almost completely. The sail hung limply. The launch drifted slowly beneath an unforgiving tropical sun. Now the oars became essential once again. The men pulled steadily despite aching muscles and blistered hands. Each stroke demanded energy they could scarcely spare. The boat moved only gradually. There were moments when it seemed the ocean itself resisted every effort. Still, nobody suggested giving up. Bligh encouraged the crew whenever possible. His leadership remained practical rather than dramatic. He did not promise certain success. He did not pretend the danger had disappeared. Instead, he reminded the men how much they had already accomplished. Every sunrise meant another day survived. Every evening meant another section of the Pacific lay behind them. Those small victories mattered. As the launch approached the western Pacific, signs of land became more frequent. Seabirds appeared regularly. Floating branches drifted past. Occasionally patches of seaweed suggested nearby islands. Bligh interpreted each clue carefully. The voyage demanded constant judgment. Approaching unknown shores carried obvious risks after the deadly encounter at Tofua. Avoiding every island entirely risked missing opportunities for fresh water. Experience told him when caution should outweigh necessity. One morning, distant islands became visible once again. The men stared silently toward them. After so many days surrounded only by water, even the faint outline of land stirred powerful emotions. Some hoped they might finally rest. Others remembered John Norton's death and remained wary. Bligh examined the coastline through his telescope. He recognized that these islands lay along the route toward the Dutch East Indies. Carefully avoiding reefs and dangerous shallows, he continued without attempting a landing. The decision disappointed some of the crew, yet they trusted his judgment. Better to remain hungry than risk another violent confrontation. Meanwhile, Fletcher Christian's own voyage entered a new stage. After leaving Tahiti once again, the Bounty sailed through the Pacific searching for a permanent refuge. Christian carried with him a small community rather than merely a ship's crew. Alongside the remaining mutineers traveled Tahitian men, Tahitian women, and several children. Their future depended entirely upon finding an island unknown, or at least forgotten by the outside world. Christian studied available charts carefully. One location attracted his attention: Pitcairn Island. It had been recorded by earlier European navigators, but there was reason to believe its position on existing charts was inaccurate. If the island truly lay where Christian believed, it might provide the isolation the mutineers desperately needed. If it did not, the search would continue across an ocean already filled with uncertainty. Back in the launch, William Bligh remained unaware that Christian was making these decisions. His own world had become wonderfully simple. Keep the boat afloat. Protect the food. Preserve the water. Navigate west. Everything else belonged to another life. The men themselves had changed. Weeks of shared hardship had erased many differences in rank and background. Although naval discipline remained, survival had created a deeper bond. Each sailor understood that every other man aboard contributed directly to the success of the voyage. No one could complete such a journey alone. As another evening settled across the Pacific, the exhausted crew watched the sunset spread brilliant shades of orange and crimson across the sea. The beauty of the moment contrasted strangely with their condition. Sunburned, salt-covered, hungry, yet still alive, still moving, still following the steady course set by William Bligh. With each passing day, the impossible voyage drew closer to its destination. Soon, after weeks alone upon the open ocean, the first true signs of civilization would finally begin to appear on the horizon. The farther west the launch traveled, the more noticeable the signs became. Seabirds appeared in greater numbers each morning, rarely straying far from the direction in which William Bligh intended to sail. Pieces of floating bamboo drifted across the water. Occasionally, branches carrying fresh green leaves passed close enough for the men to reach out and touch them. These were small things. To exhausted sailors they meant everything. Nature itself seemed to be whispering that land could not be very far away. Bligh continued recording each day's progress with remarkable precision. Even after weeks of hardship, he refused to abandon the habits that had defined his career. Whenever the weather allowed, he calculated their position. He estimated distance traveled. He noted the direction of the wind and the condition of the sea. His journal remained practical and disciplined, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Those careful entries would later become one of the most valuable historical records of the voyage. The crew themselves had changed almost beyond recognition. The men who had climbed into the launch after the mutiny had still carried some physical strength from months aboard the Bounty. Now their faces had become noticeably thinner. Cheekbones stood out sharply. Beards had grown wild. Salt had bleached and stiffened their clothing. Hands once strong enough to climb the highest rigging now trembled after hours of rowing. Yet something else had grown stronger. Their confidence in one another. Weeks of survival had created a quiet understanding among the 18 men. Commands no longer required explanation. If Bligh ordered the sail adjusted, hands moved immediately. If water entered the boat, everyone instinctively reached for whatever could be used to bail. Each man understood his place. Every movement had become almost automatic. The launch itself bore the marks of constant use. Its wooden planks had endured relentless sun during the day and cool ocean air at night. Salt coated nearly every surface. The little mast had survived repeated storms. The boat seemed fragile against the vast Pacific, yet it continued carrying its passengers mile after mile. Bligh knew they were approaching waters more familiar to European navigators. Although dangers still remained, every successful calculation increased his confidence that they had not drifted hopelessly off course. He had trusted his memory. So far, that trust had been justified. The weather, however, reminded them never to become careless. One evening, powerful winds returned without much warning. Dark clouds covered the stars that normally guided Bligh's nighttime observations. Rain swept across the sea. Large waves struck the overloaded launch from several directions at once. The exhausted crew immediately returned to the routine they knew so well. Some steadied the mast. Others worked continuously to remove water from inside the boat. No one complained. No one panicked. The storm demanded all their attention. For hours they fought simply to remain afloat. When morning finally arrived, the sea had calmed once again. The launch remained battered but intact. The men looked at one another with tired smiles. Another danger had passed. Another sunrise had been earned. The remaining food continued disappearing. The bread was now carefully broken into even smaller portions. Every crumb mattered. Fresh water remained limited despite the rain they had collected during earlier storms. Bligh never relaxed the rationing. He understood that optimism could become as dangerous as despair. Until they reached safety, every supply remained precious. At last, after weeks of open ocean, distant islands appeared that Bligh recognized from earlier voyages and existing navigational knowledge. They had reached the region of the eastern Dutch East Indies. For the first time since leaving Tofua, the possibility of reaching European civilization seemed genuinely close. The men could hardly believe it. Many had privately assumed they would die long before reaching this part of the world. Now the outlines of unfamiliar islands slowly confirmed that their captain's calculations had been astonishingly accurate. The launch carefully threaded its way through dangerous waters. Coral reefs surrounded many islands. Hidden rocks waited just beneath the surface. A single mistake now, after surviving thousands of miles, could destroy everything. Bligh remained as cautious as ever. His concentration never weakened. Every course adjustment reflected years of accumulated experience. Meanwhile, across another part of the Pacific, Fletcher Christian's search for refuge continued. The Bounty sailed from island to island as Christian evaluated every possibility. He understood that merely finding fertile land would not be enough. The island also had to remain hidden from British ships. Pitcairn Island increasingly appeared to offer that chance. Historical charts placed it several miles away from its actual position. That navigational error, unnoticed by earlier mapmakers, might become the mutineers' greatest protection. Christian could not know with certainty whether the island would provide fresh water, fertile soil, or a safe harbor. He only knew that remaining anywhere familiar greatly increased the risk of eventual capture. The future of every man, woman, and child aboard the Bounty depended upon finding a place that the outside world had effectively forgotten. Back in the launch, William Bligh's attention remained fixed on a different goal. As the days passed, signs of European influence gradually increased. Occasionally the crew noticed evidence of trade routes known to Dutch merchants. The sea no longer felt quite so isolated. Civilization was somewhere ahead. The thought filled the exhausted men with quiet determination. Still, Bligh refused to celebrate too early. He reminded the crew that reefs, storms, and simple exhaustion remained dangerous until the very end of the journey. Many voyages had failed within sight of safety. The launch pressed onward. Each mile now carried a growing sense of expectation. Nearly 6 weeks had passed since the morning of the mutiny. Against every reasonable expectation, 18 men in a crowded open boat had crossed one of the greatest expanses of ocean on Earth. Ahead, beyond the next stretch of water, lay Timor, a destination that had once seemed almost impossible to imagine. Now, for the first time, it was almost within reach. By the beginning of June 1789, the men in the launch had been at sea for more than 5 weeks. Each sunrise marked another victory. Not a victory celebrated with cheers or triumph, but one measured quietly by the simple fact that every man who had survived Tofua was still alive. The launch no longer looked like the tidy boat that had drifted away from HMS Bounty. Its wood was stained by salt. The sail had endured countless hours beneath tropical sunlight and sudden storms. The ropes showed constant use. Every corner of the boat reflected the extraordinary journey it had already completed. The men looked much the same. Their skin had darkened beneath the relentless sun. Their clothes were faded, stiff with dried salt, and badly worn. Many had lost considerable weight. Their faces were thinner, their movements slower, yet their determination remained remarkably steady. William Bligh continued his routine exactly as before. No matter how exhausted he became, he refused to neglect navigation. Each observation of the sun confirmed that they were still making progress. Every calculation strengthened his belief that Timor lay somewhere ahead. His confidence spread quietly through the crew. No dramatic speeches were necessary. The simple fact that Bligh continued working with precision gave the others reason to continue as well. As the launch entered the waters surrounding the Dutch East Indies, navigation became even more demanding. The open Pacific had presented one set of dangers. These waters presented another. Numerous islands, narrow passages, hidden reefs, and changing currents required constant attention. A navigator could no longer steer a straightforward course across empty ocean. Every decision demanded careful judgment. Bligh relied upon memories gathered years earlier during Pacific exploration. He recognized coastlines. He identified islands whose positions had remained fixed in his memory since sailing with Captain James Cook. Those earlier experiences, once simply valuable, had now become essential. One mistake among the reefs could destroy the launch within minutes. The men rowed carefully through unfamiliar channels. Lookouts watched constantly for breakers revealing hidden coral beneath the surface. The water itself often changed color. Deep blue suddenly gave way to brilliant turquoise, warning experienced sailors that shallow reefs lay just below. Whenever such signs appeared, Bligh adjusted course immediately. Progress became slower, but safety mattered far more than speed. Food had nearly disappeared. The remaining bread was divided into tiny portions. The men understood that these final rations had to last until help arrived. Hunger had become almost ordinary. Their bodies had adapted as much as possible. Thirst remained the greater enemy. Fresh water, though carefully preserved, was nearly exhausted once again. Every man knew exactly how much remained. Nobody asked for more than his share. Weeks of shared hardship had built remarkable discipline. Meanwhile, the weather became increasingly favorable. Gentle winds helped the launch through the island passages. Clear skies allowed Bligh to continue his observations. Even the sea seemed calmer than it had during much of the crossing. After surviving violent storms in the open Pacific, these quieter days felt almost peaceful. The men began noticing signs that civilization truly was close. Small fishing canoes appeared in the distance. Smoke occasionally rose above forested islands. Cultivated land became visible along some shorelines. Unlike the lonely waters they had crossed earlier, these seas showed evidence of regular human activity. Hope grew stronger with each passing mile. Some sailors admitted later that, for the first time since the mutiny, they genuinely believed they would survive. Even Bligh, careful not to celebrate prematurely, recognized that the greatest challenge now lay behind them. Still, he remained cautious. The journey would not be complete until they reached a secure European settlement. History offered many examples of sailors surviving enormous hardships only to lose everything through one final mistake. No unnecessary risks would be taken. Far away across the Pacific, Fletcher Christian's voyage also approached a turning point. After leaving Tahiti with the remaining mutineers and their Polynesian companions, the Bounty continued searching among remote islands. Christian carefully examined every possibility. Most islands proved unsuitable. Some appeared too small. Others lacked secure anchorages. Several were already inhabited, increasing the likelihood that news of the mutineers might eventually spread. The search consumed valuable time. The uncertainty weighed heavily upon everyone aboard. Christian carried an enormous responsibility. He was no longer simply a naval officer. He had become the leader of a fragile community whose future depended entirely upon his judgment. At last, attention focused once more upon Pitcairn Island. The island had first been recorded by the British navigator Philip Carteret in 1767. However, its recorded position on contemporary charts contained significant errors. Those inaccuracies might provide exactly the concealment Christian sought. If the island could be found, it might remain hidden from future naval searches simply because ships would look in the wrong place. It was an extraordinary gamble. Back in the launch, another dawn broke over calm seas. The air carried a different feeling now. Not relief, not yet, but expectation. Late on June 14, 1789, after 47 remarkable days at sea and a voyage of approximately 3,600 nautical miles, William Bligh and his exhausted companions finally sighted Kuong, the principal Dutch settlement on the island of Timor. The buildings appeared almost unreal. After weeks of seeing nothing but water, the sight of roofs, anchored vessels, and signs of permanent settlement seemed almost like a dream. Some of the men could scarcely believe their eyes. Others remained silent, too exhausted to speak. The launch moved steadily toward the harbor. Dutch officials soon realized that something extraordinary had arrived. The appearance of 18 desperately thin, sunburned sailors in a small open boat demanded immediate attention. When Bligh explained who they were and where they had come from, disbelief quickly gave way to astonishment. Experienced seamen understood the distance involved. They understood the dangers. Many considered the voyage almost impossible. Yet the impossible had just entered their harbor under its own sail. William Bligh and 17 loyal companions had survived one of the greatest open-boat voyages in maritime history. Their ordeal upon the Pacific Ocean had finally come to an end. But the story of the Bounty itself was far from over. Thousands of miles away, Fletcher, Christian, and the mutineers were still searching for a place where history might never find them. The people of Kuong could hardly believe what they were seeing. A small open launch had entered the harbor carrying 18 exhausted British sailors, who claimed they had crossed more than 3,600 nautical miles of the Pacific after being cast adrift by mutineers. To experienced seamen living in the Dutch East Indies, the story sounded almost impossible. Yet the condition of the men told its own story. Their clothing was faded and stiff with salt. Their faces were thin from weeks of severe rationing. Many could barely stand after stepping onto solid ground. Some had not slept comfortably in nearly 7 weeks. For the first time since the mutiny, they no longer felt the constant movement of the sea beneath their feet. Several later described an unusual sensation. Even while standing on land, their bodies still seemed to sway as though the launch continued riding the ocean's waves. It was a common experience among sailors after long voyages. Dutch officials immediately offered assistance. Food was provided. Fresh water flowed freely for the first time in weeks. The men received clothing, shelter, and medical attention. Bligh expressed deep gratitude for the generosity shown by the Dutch authorities. Without their help, even after surviving the Pacific crossing, several of the exhausted sailors might not have recovered. Despite finally reaching safety, the hardships were not yet over. Weeks of starvation and constant exposure had severely weakened many of the men. Tropical diseases were common throughout the Dutch East Indies, particularly among visitors whose bodies had already been exhausted by long voyages. Several members of Bligh's party soon became seriously ill. The combination of physical exhaustion, poor nutrition, and unfamiliar diseases proved devastating. Sadly, not every man who survived the Pacific would survive the weeks that followed. During their stay in Timor, 4 of Bligh's companions died from illnesses, most likely including malaria and other tropical infections that were widespread in the region. These deaths were a painful reminder that reaching land did not immediately end the dangers faced by 18th-century sailors. Bligh himself also suffered from illness but gradually regained enough strength to continue his journey. Even while recovering, his attention returned to duty. He began preparing detailed reports describing the mutiny. His journal, carefully maintained despite extraordinary circumstances, became one of the most important historical documents relating to HMS Bounty. Every date, every course, every ration, every major event. Bligh understood that accuracy mattered. The British Admiralty would demand a complete account. Meanwhile, the remarkable voyage of the launch quickly attracted attention among experienced naval officers. Professional navigators recognized the extraordinary skill required. Crossing such an immense distance in an overloaded open boat without losing the entire crew seemed almost beyond belief. Even many who later criticized Bligh's leadership during the mutiny acknowledged his exceptional abilities as a navigator. The journey to Timor became one of the greatest achievements of his career. Eventually, arrangements were made for the survivors to continue toward Europe. The voyage home, however, remained long and difficult. Travel in the 18th century rarely followed direct routes. Ships depended upon favorable winds, seasonal weather, and available passages between distant ports. Months would pass before Bligh finally returned to Britain. He carried with him not only official reports but also an urgent message. HMS Bounty had been seized. The mutineers remained somewhere in the Pacific. The Royal Navy would almost certainly organize a search. Far away across that same ocean, Fletcher, Christian, and those who remained aboard the Bounty continued their own uncertain journey. After leaving Tahiti once again, Christian sailed with 8 fellow mutineers, 6 Tahitian men, 12 Tahitian women, and 1 infant. Their small community represented different backgrounds, different languages, and different expectations for the future. Some hoped to establish peaceful farms. Others simply wished to avoid British justice. Christian himself appeared increasingly quiet. Accounts written years later by surviving settlers suggest that he often carried the weight of responsibility heavily. The excitement that may have accompanied the mutiny had long disappeared. Now every decision affected the lives of families, not merely sailors. The search for Pitcairn Island continued. Finding it proved surprisingly difficult. Because its position had been recorded inaccurately on contemporary charts, locating the island required careful navigation and persistence. Ironically, the very mistake that frustrated Christian also promised future protection. If he struggled to find the island while deliberately searching for it, Royal Navy ships using the same inaccurate charts might overlook it entirely. Weeks passed. The Bounty continued sailing through remote waters. Then, in January 1790, the lookout finally spotted land. High cliffs rose sharply from the Pacific. Dense vegetation covered much of the island. This was Pitcairn. After careful examination, Christian concluded that the island offered exactly what he had hoped to find. Possessed fresh water, fertile soil, natural resources. Most importantly, it lay astonishingly isolated. Very few ships passed anywhere nearby. The mutineers began unloading everything that might help them build new lives. Livestock, gear, tools, timber, food supplies. Every useful object from the Bounty came ashore. Once the work was complete, Christian made a decision that would permanently separate his little community from the outside world. The Bounty herself would be destroyed. On January 23, 1790, the ship that had carried them across half the globe was deliberately set on fire in Bounty Bay. Flames spread through the timbers. Smoke rose above the island. Eventually, the vessel burned to the waterline before sinking beneath the waves. Historians continue debating whether Christian burned the ship primarily to prevent anyone from leaving or to eliminate evidence that might reveal their location. Perhaps both reasons played a part. Whatever his motivation, the result was unmistakable. There would be no easy return. The settlers of Pitcairn had committed themselves completely to their new home. Behind them, beneath the clear waters of the Pacific, rested the charred remains of HMS Bounty. Ahead lay an uncertain future on one of the most isolated islands on Earth, a future that would prove every bit as complicated, tragic, and fascinating as the mutiny itself. When the last flames died away and the remains of HMS Bounty slipped beneath the clear waters of what is now known as Bounty Bay, the settlers understood that an important chapter of their lives had ended forever. There would be no sailing back to Tahiti. There would be no return to Britain. There would be no opportunity to change their minds. The ship that had carried them across thousands of miles of ocean now rested beneath the sea, leaving Pitcairn Island as their only home. The island itself was both beautiful and demanding. Steep cliffs surrounded much of its coastline, making landings difficult even in calm weather. Dense forests covered the interior. Freshwater springs flowed through valleys. Fertile volcanic soil offered the possibility of successful farming. To men who had spent years aboard ships, the island promised stability. To survive there, however, would require far more than hope. The new settlement consisted of very different groups of people. There were 9 British mutineers, including Fletcher Christian. Alongside them lived 6 Tahitian men, 12 Tahitian women, and 1 infant who had arrived from Tahiti. Each group brought its own language, customs, traditions, and expectations. Creating a peaceful community from such different backgrounds would prove far more difficult than simply building houses and planting crops. First, everyone focused on practical work. Shelters had to be constructed before bad weather arrived. Food crops needed to be planted as quickly as possible. Livestock brought from the Bounty had to be protected and cared for. Tools recovered before the ship was burned became priceless possessions. Iron nails, axes, saws, and farming equipment could not be replaced. Every useful object from the ship suddenly carried enormous value. Christian attempted to organize the settlement. Although he had led the mutiny, governing a permanent community required very different skills. There was no Royal Navy discipline to rely upon. No Admiralty regulations. No outside authority. Every disagreement had to be settled within the tiny colony itself. At first, cooperation remained possible. The settlers cleared land. They planted yams, bananas, taro, sweet potatoes, and other crops suited to the island's climate. Fruit trees gradually became established. Fishing supplemented their diet. Wild birds and other natural resources provided additional food. The island appeared capable of supporting them. Yet beneath this promising beginning lay serious problems. The balance between the British mutineers and the Tahitian men quickly became a source of tension. The British controlled most of the firearms. They also tended to make the major decisions regarding work and property. The Tahitian men increasingly found themselves treated as laborers rather than equals. Modern historians recognize that these inequalities contributed directly to later violence. The relationships within the settlement reflected the attitudes of the 18th century, including assumptions about status and authority that would prove deeply destructive. Christian himself appears to have spent much of his time farming and helping establish the new community. Accounts from later survivors suggest that he worked hard and generally avoided unnecessary conflict. However, no amount of personal effort could completely remove the underlying tensions that were developing. Life on Pitcairn demanded patience. There were no merchants, no neighboring villages, no passing ships bringing supplies. Everything had to be produced locally. When a tool broke, someone had to repair it. When crops failed, everyone suffered. When disagreements arose, there was nowhere else to go. Isolation, which had once seemed their greatest protection, gradually became one of their greatest challenges. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, William Bligh finally reached Britain in March 1790 after completing the long journey from the Dutch East Indies. His arrival attracted enormous attention. News of the mutiny spread rapidly. The public found the story irresistible. A Royal Navy vessel had been seized in the distant Pacific. Its captain had crossed thousands of miles in a small open boat. The mutineers had vanished. Bligh immediately presented his journals and official reports to the Admiralty. An official court-martial examined the loss of HMS Bounty, as required whenever a Royal Navy ship was lost. Bligh was formally acquitted of responsibility for the loss of his command. His remarkable navigation to Timor earned widespread professional admiration. The Admiralty accepted that the mutiny had not resulted from navigational incompetence or failure to fulfill the expedition's mission. Attention quickly shifted toward finding the missing mutineers. The British government had no intention of allowing such a serious act of rebellion to go unanswered. Preparations began for a search expedition. The task would eventually be entrusted to Captain Edward Edwards aboard HMS Pandora. His orders were clear. Sail to the Pacific. Search for the mutineers. Arrest every survivor who could be found. Bring them back to Britain to stand trial. The Pacific, however, covered an immense area. Christian's decision to seek a remote refuge greatly complicated the search. No one in Britain knew where the Bounty had gone after the mutiny. Tahiti seemed the most obvious place to investigate. Whether the mutineers remained there, or had continued elsewhere, was entirely unknown. Back on Pitcairn Island, the settlers knew nothing about these developments. They believed the ocean surrounding them had hidden their existence. The remains of the Bounty lay beneath the clear waters of the bay, invisible to passing ships. Smoke no longer rose from the burned vessel. Months passed quietly. Gardens expanded. Children began growing. The settlement slowly transformed from a group of fugitives into a tiny isolated colony. Yet beneath the calm surface, resentment continued to grow. The unequal treatment of the Tahitian men, disputes over authority, and personal conflicts among the settlers steadily weakened the fragile peace. The greatest danger facing the Pitcairn community would not come from the Royal Navy. It would come from within. The violence that had been avoided during the mutiny itself was quietly gathering strength on the island, waiting for the moment when neighbors would begin turning against one another. For a short time, life on Pitcairn Island seemed to settle into a quiet rhythm. The gardens began producing food. Banana trees flourished in the warm climate. Yams and sweet potatoes grew well in the rich volcanic soil. Goats, pigs, chickens, and other animals brought from the Bounty slowly multiplied, providing the settlers with a more reliable food supply. The dense forest supplied timber for homes, fences, and tools. Fresh water flowed from springs in the hills. To an outside observer arriving during those early months, the settlement might have appeared successful. The mutineers had found exactly what they had hoped for, a remote island capable of supporting life. But survival depended on far more than fertile soil. It depended on trust. That trust was beginning to disappear. The population of the island remained very small. 9 British mutineers, 6 Tahitian men, 12 Tahitian women, several children. Every disagreement became personal because there was nowhere else to go. No neighboring town existed where someone could begin a new life. No authority stood above the settlers to resolve disputes. The island itself became their entire world. One of the greatest sources of tension involved equality. The British sailors generally considered themselves the leaders of the community. They possessed most of the firearms salvaged from the Bounty. They controlled many of the valuable tools. The Tahitian men performed much of the physical labor but did not enjoy equal influence over decisions. Modern historians view this imbalance as one of the central causes of the tragedy that followed. The historical records suggest that resentment gradually deepened. The Tahitian men believed they were treated unfairly. Some also objected to the distribution of land and resources. The British, meanwhile, feared losing control of the settlement they had struggled so hard to establish. Neither side fully trusted the other. Fletcher Christian found himself in an increasingly difficult position. He had once been a respected master's mate aboard a Royal Navy ship. Now he was expected to lead a tiny colony isolated from the rest of humanity. The skills required were entirely different. Christian appears to have worked alongside the others, farming and helping construct the settlement. Accounts from the later survivors describe him as quieter than he had been during the days before the mutiny. Some historians believe the weight of responsibility affected him deeply. He had sought freedom from William Bligh's command. Instead, he had inherited an even greater burden. As months passed, arguments became more frequent. The disagreements were not always dramatic. Sometimes they involved work assignments. Sometimes they concerned property. Sometimes they reflected personal relationships within the close-knit community. On a small island, even minor disagreements could not easily be escaped. Every person saw the same faces every day. Every unresolved conflict lingered. By September 1793, nearly 4 years after the mutineers had settled on Pitcairn, the situation reached a breaking point. Historical accounts differ in some details because only a handful of people survived to describe what happened. Even so, the broad sequence of events is reasonably well established. Several Tahitian men, frustrated by what they regarded as unequal treatment, decided to use violence. The attack came suddenly. Armed with muskets, they confronted the British mutineers. The peaceful farming community was transformed within moments. Gunfire echoed across the island. The conflict was brief but devastating. Fletcher Christian was among those killed. Exactly where he died remains uncertain. Later traditions placed his death near the fields where he had been working, but the surviving historical evidence cannot confirm every detail with certainty. What is clear is that Christian did not live long enough to see whether the isolated refuge he had searched for would truly succeed. Several other mutineers also died during the fighting. The violence did not end there. The surviving British settlers quickly retaliated. Supported by some of the Tahitian women, they tracked down and killed the Tahitian men responsible for the attacks. Within a very short period, much of the original adult male population had disappeared. The island that had promised peace had instead become the scene of deadly conflict. The tragedy did not arise from a single argument. It emerged from years of unresolved inequality, mistrust, and resentment. Isolation had prevented outside interference. It had also prevented outside mediation. Once violence began, there was no authority capable of stopping it. The community had to live with the consequences alone. Far away in Britain, none of these events were yet known. The Admiralty had already dispatched HMS Pandora under Captain Edward Edwards to search for the mutineers. The ship sailed into the Pacific in 1791, following the most likely clues available at the time. As expected, Edwards headed first toward Tahiti. The decision reflected sound reasoning. Many officers believed the mutineers would naturally return to the island where they had spent 5 comfortable months. In that assumption they were partly correct. When Pandora reached Tahiti in March 1791, 16 former members of the Bounty were found living there. Some had remained by choice. Others had been left behind when Christian sailed away in search of a more isolated refuge. These men offered little resistance. One by one, they were arrested and placed aboard Pandora. Captain Edwards ordered a wooden prison to be built on the ship's quarterdeck. The cramped enclosure soon earned a grim nickname among sailors. It became known simply as Pandora's Box. The prisoners now faced the long voyage back to Britain, where courts-martial and possible execution awaited them. Meanwhile, Captain Edwards continued searching the Pacific for Fletcher Christian and the remaining mutineers. He had no idea that Christian was already dead. Nor did he know that the Bounty itself had been burned and sunk beneath the waters of an island so inaccurately charted that it remained effectively hidden from the world. Captain Edward Edwards refused to end the search after arresting the 16 former members of the Bounty on Tahiti. His mission from the Admiralty had been broader than simply recovering those who had remained behind. Fletcher Christian and the men who had sailed away with him were still missing, and HMS Pandora continued westward across the Pacific in the hope of finding them. The task was extraordinarily difficult. The Pacific covered millions of square miles. There were countless islands, many only briefly visited by European explorers. Navigation remained dependent upon charts that were sometimes incomplete or inaccurate. Christian had deliberately chosen isolation, and without knowing his destination, Captain Edwards could do little more than investigate the most likely locations. The prisoners remained confined inside the wooden structure built upon Pandora's deck. The sailors themselves nicknamed it Pandora's Box. It was cramped, hot, and uncomfortable. Although later stories sometimes exaggerated its conditions, surviving records show that imprisonment aboard an 18th-century naval vessel was harsh enough without embellishment. The men understood what probably awaited them in Britain. Mutiny against a commissioned naval officer was among the gravest crimes recognized by Royal Navy regulations. Conviction often meant death by hanging. As the weeks passed, Pandora sailed through island groups already familiar to European navigators. Captain Edwards questioned local inhabitants whenever possible. He searched anchorages. He examined every promising lead. Again and again, the trail ended without success. No reliable information pointed toward Christian's whereabouts. The mutineers who had remained on Tahiti possessed little knowledge of his final destination. Most genuinely did not know where he intended to settle. That uncertainty greatly complicated the search. Unknown to everyone aboard Pandora, Fletcher Christian had already found Pitcairn Island many months earlier. The ship they sought no longer existed. Its charred remains rested beneath the waters of Bounty Bay. Even if Edwards had sailed close to the island, inaccurate charts made locating it extremely unlikely. One of Christian's greatest hopes, that the island's incorrect position would protect the settlement, was proving true. Then, disaster struck the search expedition itself. On the night of August 29, 1791, HMS Pandora approached the outer edge of the Great Barrier Reef off the northeastern coast of Australia. These waters ranked among the most dangerous in the world. Coral formations stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the surface. Many reefs remained poorly charted. Navigation demanded constant vigilance. Despite every precaution, Pandora struck the reef. The impact was devastating. The ship grounded hard upon the coral. Water immediately poured into the hull. Captain Edwards ordered every possible effort to save the vessel. Pumps worked continuously. The crew attempted to lighten the ship by throwing heavy equipment overboard. Nothing stopped the flooding. As the situation worsened, it became clear that HMS Pandora could not be saved. The crew prepared the boats. In the confusion, another terrible question emerged. What should be done with the prisoners? Historical accounts indicate that the men confined inside Pandora's box were not released immediately. Some officers later stated that the priority remained saving the ship. Others argued that confusion and rapidly rising water delayed every decision. Whatever the precise reasons, precious time was lost. Eventually the prisoners were freed. But not all escaped. 4 of the captured bounty men drowned as Pandora sank beneath the sea. 31 members of the ship's crew also lost their lives. The search vessel sent to capture the mutineers had itself become another maritime tragedy. Captain Edwards and the survivors escaped in the ship's boats. Remarkably, they managed to navigate toward Timor, following a route similar in general direction to the one William Bligh had completed after the mutiny. Although difficult, their journey covered a much shorter distance than Bligh's extraordinary voyage in the open launch. After many hardships, the survivors eventually reached safety. The surviving prisoners remained under guard throughout the journey. Their fate still awaited them in Britain. Meanwhile, on Pitcairn Island, the small settlement struggled to recover from the violence that had claimed the lives of Fletcher Christian and several others. Only a handful of the original British mutineers remained alive. Among them was John Adams, originally known as Alexander Smith, a sailor who would eventually become the central figure in the island's future. The years following the killings were marked by further hardship. Alcohol distilled from local plants contributed to additional disputes. Personal conflicts continued. Several more deaths occurred from illness, accidents, and violence. By the end of the 1790s, the dream of building a peaceful refuge had nearly collapsed. Of the 9 British mutineers who had landed on Pitcairn in January 1790, only one would ultimately survive into the 19th century. That survivor was John Adams. Around him remained the Tahitian women and a growing number of children born on the island. The children had never seen Britain. They had never seen Tahiti. Pitcairn was the only world they had ever known. As the years passed, Adams underwent a profound personal change. Historical accounts from later visitors suggest that he turned increasingly toward the Bible salvaged from the Bounty. He began teaching the island's children to read. He encouraged regular worship. He attempted to replace the violence of the settlement's early years with a more orderly and peaceful way of life. Whether motivated by genuine religious conviction, remorse for the past, or both, Adams gradually became the accepted leader of the remaining community. Far beyond the horizon, the British Admiralty still believed that some of the mutineers remained at large. No one in London knew that the search for Fletcher Christian had already become impossible. The man whose name had become forever linked with the mutiny had been dead for years. His final resting place remained hidden on one of the most isolated islands in the Pacific, an island that the outside world had still not found. By the opening years of the 19th century, Pitcairn Island had almost disappeared from the world's memory. For the British Admiralty, the story of the mutiny had not been forgotten, but the Pacific was vast, and the trail had gone cold. Fletcher Christian had vanished. HMS Bounty had vanished. No confirmed reports explained where the remaining mutineers had gone after leaving Tahiti. To most people in Britain, they were simply lost somewhere beyond the horizon. On Pitcairn itself, life had become astonishingly different from the violent years that followed the settlement. The fighting that had claimed Fletcher Christian, several other mutineers, and the Tahitian men had left only one surviving British mutineer, John Adams. Born John Adams but known aboard the Bounty as Alexander Smith, he now found himself responsible for a community made up largely of Tahitian women and children born on the island. The settlement no longer resembled a group of naval fugitives. It had become a small, isolated society. The children growing up there knew almost nothing about the world beyond the sea. Britain existed only as stories. Tahiti survived only in the memories of their mothers. The Bounty itself was no more than a tale told by the adults who remembered the ship before it was burned. John Adams gradually emerged as the community's teacher and leader. According to later visitors, one of the most valuable possessions recovered from the Bounty had been a Bible, along with a prayer book. Adams began reading these regularly. He also used them to educate the children. Many historians believe this marked a genuine transformation in his character. Earlier in life, Adams had participated in one of the Royal Navy's most famous mutinies. Now he devoted much of his time to raising children, settling disputes peacefully, and encouraging education and religious practice. Whether this change came through deep personal faith, regret over the past, or the simple responsibilities of leadership cannot be measured with certainty. The historical record, however, consistently describes a calmer and more disciplined community than the one that had existed during the island's early years. The children learned practical skills alongside reading and religious instruction. They farmed the fertile soil. They cared for animals descended from those brought ashore from the Bounty. They fished in the surrounding waters. Every member of the community contributed to daily life. Isolation remained their greatest challenge. No regular trade existed. Metal tools slowly wore out through years of use. Clothing had to be repaired repeatedly. Whenever an important object broke beyond repair, replacing it was impossible. The island demanded resourcefulness. Every generation learned how to make the best possible use of limited materials. As the years passed, passing ships occasionally sailed through nearby waters without noticing the island. Pitcairn was small. Its position remained inaccurate on many charts. A vessel could pass surprisingly close while never seeing land. Christian's decision to choose such an isolated refuge continued protecting the settlement long after his death. Back in Britain, meanwhile, the captured mutineers who had survived the sinking of HMS Pandora finally arrived to face justice. Their trials began before a naval court-martial in September 1792 aboard HMS Duke in Portsmouth Harbour. The proceedings attracted enormous public interest. Witnesses described the events aboard the Bounty. William Bligh presented his testimony. The surviving prisoners explained their own actions. Some argued they had been forced to remain with the mutineers. Others insisted they had not willingly joined the rebellion. The court carefully considered each man's role. The verdicts reflected those differences. Several prisoners were acquitted after evidence showed they had not voluntarily supported the mutiny. Others were found guilty. Ultimately, 3 men, Thomas Burkett, John Millward and Thomas Ellison, were sentenced to death and executed by hanging on October 29, 1792. Peter Heywood and James Morrison, although initially sentenced to death, later received royal pardons after appeals and evidence regarding their conduct. These trials demonstrated that the Admiralty distinguished between different levels of involvement, rather than treating every sailor identically. Justice, as understood by the Royal Navy of the period, depended upon each individual's actions during the mutiny. Even after the executions, however, one question remained unanswered. What had become of Fletcher Christian? Rumors spread across Britain for years. Some claimed he had secretly returned to England. Others insisted he had established a hidden kingdom somewhere in the Pacific. A few stories even suggested he had escaped to South America under another name. None of these tales rested upon reliable evidence. Without knowing the location of Pitcairn Island, the truth remained beyond reach. The mystery only increased public fascination. Novelists, journalists, and storytellers continued speculating about Christian's fate. Meanwhile, the real answer quietly unfolded on a remote volcanic island where children born after the mutiny played beneath fruit trees, unaware that the outside world still searched for the man who had once led the rebellion aboard HMS Bounty. It would take another remarkable voyage before the silence surrounding Pitcairn finally ended, and the long-lost descendants of the mutineers stepped back into recorded history. For nearly 18 years after the Bounty disappeared from the known world, Pitcairn Island remained almost completely isolated. Storms came and went. Children grew into young adults. Gardens expanded across the fertile valleys. The memories of the mutiny slowly became stories told around evening fires, rather than events that had happened only yesterday. The outside world, however, still knew nothing about the fate of Fletcher Christian's settlement. Many maps continued marking Pitcairn Island in an inaccurate position. Some charts omitted it altogether. Others placed it several miles away from its true location. Those small navigational errors, insignificant to most sailors, became the greatest protection the island community could have hoped for. Every ship that sailed through the Pacific without finding Pitcairn unknowingly confirmed Christian's gamble. Then, in February 1808, chance finally ended nearly 2 decades of complete isolation. The American sealing ship Topaz, commanded by Captain Mayhew Folger, was sailing through the South Pacific searching for profitable hunting grounds. Folger had no intention of solving one of Britain's greatest maritime mysteries. He simply followed his course across the ocean. On February 6, 1808, land appeared where many charts suggested little or nothing should exist. As the Topaz approached, something even more surprising caught the crew's attention. People were standing along the shore. Soon, several canoes paddled out toward the American vessel. The men aboard the Topaz expected to meet islanders who had never encountered Europeans. Instead, one of the young men in the canoe spoke English. Not perfect English. Not the polished speech of London. But unmistakably English. Captain Folger was astonished. The young islander introduced himself as Thursday October Christian, the son of Fletcher Christian and the Tahitian woman Maritime. The unusual name reflected the date of his birth, a naming tradition that occasionally appeared among sailors of the period. Folger immediately realized something extraordinary had happened. As conversations continued, the remarkable truth slowly emerged. The young people who greeted the Americans had been born on Pitcairn. Most had never left the island. They had learned English from John Adams, the last surviving British mutineer. Captain Folger came ashore to meet the community. There he found John Adams, now an older man carrying the weight of nearly 20 years of isolation. Adams openly explained the history of the settlement. He described the mutiny, the burning of the Bounty, the violence that had claimed Fletcher Christian and nearly all the other adult men. He admitted his own participation in the mutiny but also explained how the community had changed. Folger carefully observed what he saw. His descriptions later became some of the most valuable historical accounts of early Pitcairn. He found a peaceful settlement. The children were polite. The adults appeared industrious. The gardens were productive. Religious instruction played an important role in daily life. The island did not resemble a refuge of dangerous pirates or hardened criminals. Instead, it appeared to be a small farming community living according to simple routines. Folger was particularly impressed by John Adams. Rather than finding a violent rebel hiding from justice, he encountered a man respected by the islanders as their teacher and leader. Adams showed genuine concern for the children and accepted responsibility for educating them. The captain later reported that the entire community displayed honesty, courtesy, and discipline. These observations would influence later British decisions regarding Adams' fate. Captain Folger remained only a short time. Before departing, he exchanged gifts and supplies with the islanders. Metal tools were especially valuable. After nearly 2 decades of isolation, iron had become increasingly scarce. Every nail, knife, and farming tool mattered enormously. In return, the islanders provided fresh fruit and shared their remarkable story. When the Topaz finally sailed away, it carried far more than ordinary cargo. It carried the answer to a mystery that had puzzled Britain for years. Fletcher Christian had indeed found a refuge. The Bounty had been burned. One mutineer still lived. An entire new generation had grown up on Pitcairn Island. News of Folger's discovery spread gradually as his reports reached other ports. Eventually, word reached Britain. The Admiralty now faced an unusual situation. John Adams had unquestionably participated in the mutiny. Under ordinary circumstances, he could have faced arrest and trial. Yet nearly 20 years had passed. He had become the guardian of an isolated community composed largely of women and children who depended upon him. Removing him from the island might punish one man while harming dozens of innocent people. British officials considered the circumstances carefully. No warship immediately arrived to arrest Adams. Public opinion had also begun changing. Many people viewed the Pitcairn story with fascination rather than anger. The mutiny itself remained a serious crime. But the surviving settlement represented something entirely different, a unique community that had developed far beyond the events of 1789. The discovery of Pitcairn closed one chapter of the Bounty's history. At the same time, it opened another. The descendants of the mutineers would soon become known throughout the English-speaking world, while writers, historians, and later filmmakers would transform the story of William Bligh and Fletcher Christian into one of the most famous maritime legends ever told. Only one final chapter remained, the lasting legacy of the mutiny itself, and how history has judged the two men whose conflict aboard a small naval ship echoed across more than 2 centuries. As reports from Captain Mayhew Folger's voyage spread across Britain, Europe, and the United States, the story of the Bounty entered a new stage. It was no longer simply the account of a naval mutiny. It had become a story about survival, leadership, justice, isolation, and the unpredictable paths that history sometimes follows. For the British Admiralty, the legal questions surrounding the mutiny had largely been settled years earlier. The captured mutineers had faced trial. Some had been acquitted. Some had received pardons. Others had been executed according to the laws governing the Royal Navy. John Adams, however, remained on Pitcairn Island. By the time Britain learned of his survival, the situation had changed completely. He was no longer a young sailor hiding from punishment. He had become the central figure in a peaceful community whose children depended upon him for guidance and education. British naval officers who later visited the island carefully observed daily life. One of the most influential visits came in 1814, when the Royal Navy ships HMS Britain and HMS Tagus reached Pitcairn during a voyage through the Pacific. Their captains, Sir Thomas Staines and Philip Pepon, expected to find a fugitive mutineer. Instead, they discovered something very different. The islanders welcomed the visitors warmly. The children spoke English fluently. Many could read and write. The settlement appeared orderly, clean, and productive. The officers spent time walking through the gardens and homes, speaking with John Adams and the younger generation. Their reports described a community that valued hard work, family life, and religious instruction. The officers were especially impressed by Adams' role. He openly acknowledged his past. He did not attempt to deny participating in the mutiny. At the same time, his conduct over the previous 2 decades demonstrated a remarkable transformation. He had become a respected leader whose influence had shaped nearly every child born on the island. Captain Staines concluded that removing Adams from Pitcairn would serve little useful purpose. His recommendation carried considerable weight. As a result, no effort was made to arrest him. John Adams spent the remainder of his life on Pitcairn, dying peacefully in 1829 at approximately 65 years of age. He became the last surviving British mutineer from the original group that had settled the island. The descendants of the Bounty community continued living on Pitcairn long after Adams' death. Generation followed generation. Many carried the surnames Christian, Young, McCoy, Quintal, Brown, and Adams, names tracing directly back to the original settlers. Although the population remained small, the island became one of the most unusual communities in the Pacific. Its history attracted increasing attention throughout the 19th century. Writers found the story irresistible. How could they not? A respected naval officer, a trusted subordinate, a mutiny in the middle of the Pacific, an extraordinary open-boat voyage, a hidden island, a burned ship, years of complete isolation. Every element seemed almost too remarkable to be true, yet it was. As the decades passed, however, storytellers often simplified the real history. Some portrayed William Bligh as nothing more than a cruel tyrant whose harsh treatment forced good men into rebellion. Others transformed Fletcher Christian into a flawless hero standing against injustice. The surviving historical evidence presents a far more complicated picture. Bligh certainly possessed a demanding personality. He criticized officers sharply. His language could be severe. He expected strict discipline. Yet historians have repeatedly noted that his use of corporal punishment aboard the Bounty was not unusually harsh compared with many Royal Navy commanders of the period. In fact, surviving records indicate that floggings during the Bounty voyage were relatively few. Christian, likewise, cannot easily be placed into a simple category. He had once enjoyed Bligh's friendship and confidence. He performed his duties competently for much of the voyage. Only after the long stay in Tahiti did their relationship deteriorate rapidly. Whether the mutiny resulted primarily from personal conflict, emotional strain, the attraction of life in Tahiti, concerns about discipline, or a combination of all these factors remains one of history's enduring debates. Modern historians generally avoid simple conclusions. Human decisions rarely arise from a single cause. The mutiny appears to have emerged from several pressures acting together, rather than one dramatic incident alone. Bligh's remarkable navigation to Timor remains almost universally admired. Crossing approximately 3,600 nautical miles in an overloaded open launch with 18 surviving companions stands among the greatest achievements in maritime history. At the same time, many scholars acknowledge that Bligh's leadership style could create deep personal resentment among those serving under him. Likewise, Christian inspired loyalty among several members of the crew, yet the settlement he helped establish eventually descended into deadly violence before stabilizing years later under John Adams. History leaves little room for perfect heroes or perfect villains. Instead, it presents real people making difficult decisions under extraordinary circumstances. More than 2 centuries after the events of April 1789, the names William Bligh and Fletcher Christian remain permanently linked. Their choices shaped not only their own lives but also the lives of generations who followed them. The story that began aboard a small naval ship carrying breadfruit plants had become one of the most famous true tales ever to emerge from the age of sail. Only one final reflection remains before this remarkable journey across history comes gently to its close. 24. More than 2 centuries have passed since HMS Bounty sailed into the waters of the South Pacific, yet the events of 1789 continue to fascinate historians, sailors, writers, and readers around the world. Few voyages that began with such an ordinary government mission have left such an extraordinary legacy. The original purpose of the expedition was never political or military. It was botanical. The British government hoped to transport breadfruit plants from Tahiti to the Caribbean, where they could become an inexpensive food source for enslaved laborers working on British plantations. The breadfruit mission itself ultimately failed. The plants carried aboard the Bounty never reached their intended destination because of the mutiny. Ironically, William Bligh would later be given a second opportunity. In 1791, only 2 years after the mutiny, he commanded another expedition to Tahiti aboard HMS Providence. This time the mission succeeded. Thousands of breadfruit plants were collected and transported successfully to the Caribbean. Unlike the first voyage, the second expedition completed its objective without mutiny. The achievement is often overlooked because the dramatic events aboard the Bounty have overshadowed nearly everything else in Bligh's career. His later accomplishments demonstrated that the Royal Navy continued to place considerable confidence in his navigational skill and leadership. Bligh's career did not end with the Bounty. He continued serving the Royal Navy for many years. He eventually rose to the rank of Vice Admiral. In 1806, he became Governor of New South Wales in Australia. There, he again became involved in serious conflict, this time during the event known as the Rum Rebellion, when military officers arrested and removed him from office. Although entirely separate from the Bounty, this later episode reinforced Bligh's historical reputation as a capable but often confrontational leader. His life remained controversial until the end. He died in London on December 7, 1817 at the age of 63. Fletcher Christian never lived to see how history remembered him. His life ended on Pitcairn Island during the violent conflicts of September 1793, only a little more than 4 years after the mutiny. He was approximately 28 years old. No confirmed portrait painted during his lifetime survives. Much of the familiar image of Christian seen today comes from later artistic interpretations rather than contemporary likenesses. His grave has never been conclusively identified. The remains of HMS Bounty, burned in January 1790, rested undisturbed beneath the waters of Bounty Bay for nearly 2 centuries. In 1957, explorer Louis Marden from the National Geographic Society identified the wreck site. Later archaeological investigations recovered numerous artifacts that confirmed the identity of the ship. Iron fittings, copper fastenings, ballast stones, fragments of the vessel itself. These discoveries provided physical evidence connecting modern researchers directly to one of history's most famous maritime events. Pitcairn Island also continued evolving. Its population remained small throughout the 19th century. At times, the number of inhabitants grew beyond what the island could comfortably support. In 1856, the entire community relocated to Norfolk Island under British supervision because of concerns about limited resources on Pitcairn. Some families later chose to return, while others remained on Norfolk Island permanently. Today, descendants of the original Bounty settlers can still trace their family histories back to the mutineers and their Polynesian companions. The surnames Christian, Young, Adams, Quintal, Brown, McCoy, and Buffett continue to appear among those descendants. Modern historians approach the mutiny with considerably more caution than earlier generations. The surviving evidence consists primarily of journals, official reports, naval records, letters, court testimony, and later recollections. Each source reflects the perspective of its author. Bligh naturally defended his own conduct. The mutineers explained their decisions differently. Witnesses remembered events through the passage of time. For that reason, Careful scholarship compares many independent sources before reaching conclusions. This approach has gradually replaced the simpler stories that once portrayed one man as entirely right and the other as entirely wrong. The real history proves more interesting than legend. It reveals ordinary human beings placed under extraordinary pressure. Months at sea. Isolation. Conflicting personalities. Changing loyalties. The temptation of a peaceful island after years of hardship. Strict naval discipline. Fear of punishment. Hope for freedom. Every one of these elements shaped what happened aboard HMS Bounty. Perhaps that is why the story continues to endure. It is not merely a tale of ships and oceans. It is a study of leadership, trust, responsibility, ambition, forgiveness, and consequence. The Pacific Ocean that separated William Bligh and Fletcher Christian in April 1789 also separated two very different visions of duty and freedom. Neither man escaped the consequences of the choices made that morning. Their decisions echoed across generations, creating one of the most remarkable true stories ever recorded in the long history of the sea. Only one quiet chapter remains. A final reflection on the journey itself and why, after more than 200 years, the mutiny aboard the Bounty still invites us to listen, imagine, and remember. The story of the mutiny aboard HMS Bounty began with a government expedition carrying breadfruit plants across the Pacific. It ended by leaving one of the most enduring historical legacies of the Age of Sail. On April 28, 1789, a single decision aboard a small naval vessel divided 46 men into two very different paths. One path carried Lieutenant William Bligh and 18 loyal companions into a crowded open launch with only limited food, limited water, a sextant, a compass, and the determination to survive. Over the next 47 days, they navigated approximately 3,600 nautical miles across one of the largest oceans on Earth before reaching the Dutch settlement at Timor. Historians continue to regard that voyage as one of the greatest feats of open-boat navigation ever accomplished. The other path carried Fletcher Christian and the mutineers back toward Tahiti before leading them onward to the remote cliffs of Pitcairn Island. There they hoped to leave the past behind forever. They burned the Bounty to remove every possibility of return and every obvious sign that might reveal their location. Yet isolation did not erase human conflict. Within only a few years, violence claimed Christian's life along with nearly every other adult British mutineer. Neither side escaped hardship. Bligh returned to Britain, completed another successful breadfruit expedition aboard HMS Providence, continued his naval career, and eventually became a vice admiral. His reputation as an exceptional navigator has remained remarkably strong, while debates about his leadership style continue among historians. Christian never stood before a court. He never wrote a full account explaining every thought that led to the mutiny. His story survives largely through the testimony of others, official records, and the fragments left behind by those who knew him. Because of that, some questions surrounding his motives will probably never receive complete answers. Pitcairn Island itself became one of history's most unexpected communities. The children born there grew up speaking English while also preserving important Polynesian traditions inherited from their mothers. Over generations, the descendants of the original settlers created a society unlike any other in the Pacific. Even today, the names Christian, Adams, Young, Brown, Quintal, McCoy, Buffett, and others continue to connect modern families with the extraordinary events that unfolded in 1789. Perhaps that explains why the story has never disappeared. It contains adventure without being fictional. It contains tragedy without being exaggerated. It contains courage, fear, loyalty, resentment, forgiveness, remarkable navigation, difficult leadership, and the unpredictable consequences of human choices. Every generation returns to the Bounty asking slightly different questions. Was William Bligh too demanding? Did Fletcher Christian truly have no alternative? How much influence did Tahiti have on the crew? Could the mutiny have been prevented? The historical evidence allows informed discussion, but it does not provide perfect certainty. History rarely does. Instead, it leaves us with careful records, thoughtful scholarship, and the reminder that real people are usually more complicated than legends. When we picture that quiet morning in April 1789, we can almost imagine the gentle movement of the Pacific beneath the hull of HMS Bounty. The sails caught the trade winds exactly as they had the day before. The breadfruit plants remained carefully watered. The ocean itself offered no warning that one of the most famous mutinies in maritime history was only moments away. From that single morning came an extraordinary chain of events that crossed oceans, reshaped lives, challenged empires, and inspired generations of historians, sailors, authors, filmmakers, and readers. The mutiny on the Bounty endures not because it offers simple heroes or villains, but because it reveals the complexity of human nature under extraordinary circumstances. It reminds us that leadership and loyalty are fragile, that freedom often carries unexpected costs, and that the choices made in only a few minutes can echo across centuries. Now, as this long voyage through history comes gently to rest, imagine the Pacific becoming quiet once again. The waves roll softly against distant shores. The wind moves through the palms of Pitcairn just as it did more than 200 years ago. Somewhere beneath the clear water of Bounty Bay, the remains of the little ship still rest in silence, hidden beneath coral and thyme. Close your eyes for a moment. Take one slow, deep breath. Let the sound of the sea fade into the distance, and allow the remarkable lives of William Bligh, Fletcher Christian, and everyone aboard HMS Bounty to settle gently into history once more. Thank you for spending this journey through one of the most extraordinary true stories ever recorded from the age of sail. Wherever you're listening from, may your evening be peaceful, your thoughts be calm, and your next voyage through history be just as memorable.